Fog swirled over a small river in a valley near high ancient mountains, surrounded by thickets of bushes and various herbs. Not far from this place, in the middle of a deciduous forest, full of raging greenery, as if in another world, it seemed that nothing was happening except the struggle of plants among themselves. But having gone much further into the depths, on a clearing of stone, lay a defeated detachment, among which no survivors were visible. It was clear that the battle had taken place relatively recently. There was chaos all around. Even the huge boulders had been smashed into many small stones. Dust still swirled over the dead, preventing a clear view of the aftermath of what had happened. The man who came out of the depths of the forest was terrified. The scene with the losers immediately caught his eye. He stood there and couldn't believe what he saw. Thoughts were spinning in his head. He realized that she had awakened. After 10 years of a quiet life, horror returned to his life. Lost in thought, he shuddered and his heart sank. He heard faint rustling sounds. Her hair was fluttering in the wind and seemed like the tentacles of a terrible monster. All he could do was wait for his fate. She looked at him with surprising malice and with feigned resentment asked why he was not happy to see her again. He still didn't understand who she was. He didn't believe what was happening. After all, he thought that she was terminally ill and suffering from her illness, weak and harmless. Finally, the stupefaction left him, and in its place came a furious rage. He grabbed his sword. But all it took was a small tap of her foot for everything around her to fly apart. She could not be outdone or outplayed. Everything around her rose under the pressure of her power. It was like magic. A few movements were enough for her. He didn't have time to come to his senses before he was flying backwards as if kicked by a powerful horse. The ground beneath him was cracking, making an incredible cracking sound. The man was thrown far back by a powerful energy wave. Stones of different sizes rained down on him. Dust choked him, not allowing him to take a breath of air and prohibiting him from seeing the girl. After landing, he tasted blood and felt its warm stream on his face. His body was burning from the inside with pain. He tried to recover as quickly as possible and be ready to repel further attacks. He saw only the snow-white grin of her teeth and a slight mocking half-smile. She demanded that he answer her. He heard her question about whether the blood horse was sleeping, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Her red eyes burned right through him, not allowing him to collect his thoughts. He lay there in pain, trying to accept what was happening. Blood was oozing from his wounds and scratches. She moved slowly toward him. She seemed to float in the air. He tensed, backing away slightly. The horror wouldn't let go, and he kept repeating what he had long believed. She was sick. No one knew where she was, but apparently they had lied to him. Thoughts were spinning around him, but he couldn't grasp any of them. She growled at him with great malice and the same mockery that it was not worth believing. Her hair and clothes swirled in the wind again, adding more chaos to what was happening and confusing his thoughts along with it. It took her just one movement of her hand to deprive the man of the last drop of consciousness and the chance to take at least one more breath in his life. He remained lying where she left him. She stood and looked at him indifferently, thinking only of the bloody horse. Her hair also wove in the wind, dragging her outfit along with it. She was eager to find the blood horse first, and she knew she would do whatever it took to achieve her goal. She was confident and full of malice, which gave her a chance. Lost in her thoughts and not satiated with causing pain to her enemies, she decided where to go next. In the meantime, she took advantage of the moment and enjoyed the perfect. Night fell over the forest. Only the sky, strewn with billions of bright stars, gave at least something to change in this pitch-black visibility. The voices of several children were heard from the forest. Someone asked to make broth for the return home. There was no food in the cauldron, but only a few duck bones, from which the elder brother had promised to cook the very same broth. The boy carried his sister on his shoulders, who kept repeating that she wanted to eat, and he listened patiently and reassured her that they would soon be home and eat. A third disgruntled girlish voice asked if there would be meat. The girl's long hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, revealing a clear pretension on her face. Her sister joined in, supporting the claim, because there was no meat on the bones at all. They were very unhappy that these were just bare bones, and the broth would have been very bad. The youngest rushed to defend their brother, convincing the others that he had already worked very hard to get at least such bones. One of the girls softened and asked if Appa, her brother, was hungry, since he hadn't even eaten the small piece of dumpling they had. Appa reassured the girls, saying that everything would be fine and that the broth would be full of meat. He continued walking, carrying his little sister, and his face shone with confidence, breaking into a smile. The girls calmed down and, encouraging each other, hurried home to finally cook the meat their brother had promised, eat, and rest. It was already quite dark. The children were returning home together, each lost in their own thoughts. It was obvious that they were already very tired and hungry. Without further ado, they tried to get home as quickly as possible. The older brother knew he had lied about the meat. He tried not to show the others that he was very upset. But most of all, he didn't want to upset Yusong, even though he knew for sure what awaited them at home. Finally, they began to emerge from the depths of the forest. Even faster, accelerating, almost running, they approached the house, all in anticipation of warmth and dinner. When they got to the house, the four were taken aback. They saw an old woman in their home who started yelling at them for wandering around the forest for too long and should return much earlier. Appa stepped forward, shielding his sisters, asking the woman who she was. The girls were clearly scared. The brother was also stunned by what he saw, but tried not to show it in front of his sisters. A woman who looked exactly like a witch barked loudly at them, her eyes blazing with rage, accentuated by her facial expressions. The youngest sister tightly grabbed her older brother's pants and said that she was scared. Her eyes widened significantly, and she held on to Appa as if he was the only one who would protect them all. Oppa hugged the girl. He accused the woman of coveting his home and his sisters. He acted confidently and tried his best to protect all the girls. He was a man and was responsible for them. The woman, without changing her tone, continued to shout only at him. She called him names and argued, as if he had completely lost his mind while he had wandered around somewhere all day and forgotten the most important thing. Oppa, clinging to his sister, did not understand what was happening. He did not recognize this woman and did not give himself an account of how to solve this problem. He was scared. It became difficult to hide. In Mangu Jinmuguk, the Murim Star Hall was quiet. The moonlight outlined the buildings, giving the place a special atmosphere. The silence was broken by the return of the warriors. They burst into the hall as if they had appeared out of nowhere, thus changing the atmosphere to one of tension and war. A long-haired man whose features were hidden by the darkness greeted them. His face showed no emotion. Without giving the warriors a moment to rest, he immediately began asking them if they had found anything. There were definitely a dozen people in front of him. They all bowed their heads in silence. Their faces showed annoyance and guilt. No one said a word in response. He was dissatisfied, but his face still did not express his emotions. More than half a year had passed, and the search had still not yielded any results. He expressed his dissatisfaction and his confidence that they were not trying at all. The leader of the search party was calming his master. They were looking for his mother, trying to calm him down by telling him that she was strong and would be fine. Everyone understood that everything possible was being done to find her. There was hope that it would all be over soon. The gentleman's face fell. After dropping a few phrases about how she was not as strong as she once was, because the illness was taking away her strength, he was interrupted by the commander-in-chief. The man tried to calm the master and smooth over the situation with words that the skill does not weaken, even when a fatal disease befalls a person, and the detachment continues the search and will definitely find the mother mistress. The gentleman's face took on a stern look again. He hoped that it would not take long and made this clear to his men. With obvious irritation, he wanted to make sure that no one knew about this disappearance and ordered that her illness be kept a secret. This could cause many problems. No one needed to find out the reason and no one would dare to do so. All the people sitting on the wooden floor bowed their heads before the master. A clear and confident response of agreement and obedience rushed through. The master stood and looked at his people and waited. Just as they had appeared in Maruna's hall, they disappeared. Silence and calm reigned once more. The Lord stood in the moonlight and watched the party depart. He was lost in his thoughts. He was restless. He had to find his mother before the truth came out. He couldn't let this information get to the wrong people. In a completely different place, the same search was taking place. From the darkness, many voices were coming. The same detachment was being sent. Spies who were obliged to find her faster than the others. With the same obedience and devotion, dozens of people were waiting for the order. And the order was given. They had to bring her alive. In an instant, they scattered in different directions to search. Everything happened very quickly. Only the gleam of swords was visible. Dishes were thrown at the children. The old woman went completely wild and kept shouting at them. They only had time to cover themselves with their hands from the shards of plates. The woman was indignant at how they didn't recognize her. They didn't recognize their own grandmother and didn't want to listen to her. They wandered around somewhere all day, and now they were making a scene as if they didn't know her. She was furious. Appa and his sisters just looked at the woman standing in front of them in fear and didn't know what to do. They didn't know who she was or why she was scolding them in their house. They just watched in shock. Swinging a broom, Grandma drove the children to wash. Being completely sure of her rightness, she could not control herself. Anger and irritation overwhelmed her, not allowing her screaming to subside. Opa and his sisters rushed off in the direction indicated by this woman, hearing shouts and insults as they went. They looked at each other, seeking support and clarification of the situation, but there was no answer. The ruined well stood not far from the house. There were many bushes around it, and stones from the walls of the structure were scattered around, but it was the only source of water for Op and his sisters. The children who came to bathe at the behest of their grandmother stood and could not dare to begin. It was already completely dark and cold. The water from the well was definitely icy, which made it absolutely impossible to begin bathing. Opa thought that in such conditions it was easy to get sick. That's why he hesitated for a long time, because he was very worried about his younger sisters. From behind the house, the grandmother was shouting for the children to finally cool off and not just stand there. And the girls and their brother did not understand at all how she could send them here to douse themselves with such cold water in such inappropriate weather and time. The woman approached the well and the children, who were cowering from the cold, and listened to their fears and excuses about the icy water they had to bathe in. She was still just as dissatisfied and irritated and glared at them with a stern look. She got very angry again at the excuses. She called Oppo a fool for thinking of pouring such water on himself. After all, their hot water was in the backyard, and not here in the dilapidated well. There was indeed hot water in the backyard. A large fire was lit in the middle of the yard, scorching the frozen children with its heat. A large cauldron full of boiling water stood on the fire. The grandmother began to explain to her grandchildren that they should dilute the hot water with cold and finally wash themselves and change into something warmer, and she went towards the house. The girls blinked their eyelashes even more in surprise. After all, they had nothing to change into. Everything that happened that evening was very strange for them, from the very beginning until now. The woman screamed again. She didn't understand where they had put their other clothes, and how it was that they had nothing to change into after swimming in such cold weather. One of the sisters explained that none of them had any other clothes than what they were wearing now, and she continued to blink rapidly and looked at her grandmother. Grandma didn't believe a single word either the girls or their brother said, and thought they were just making fun of her and deliberately making her angry. It couldn't be what these little liars were telling her. Oppo stepped forward and with some kind of hard-to-conceal sadness said that they didn't know what they were getting into. They have nothing. They live here, and they have nothing else. The old woman suddenly lowered her head, her irritation and anger suddenly evaporating. With a clear sense of guilt in her voice, she said that she understood without asking any more questions or picking on them. Oppo wondered if the old lady had made a mistake, but that, in any case, nothing could be done about it. He did not want to pass his words off as a complaint, and tried to say it as softly and calmly as possible. Grandma went berserk again, calling me an idiot. Sparks flew from her eyes from the returning irritation. She had been sick for so long and could only lie in bed. And now it seems she has recovered, and her grandchildren disappear somewhere all day, and returning as dirty ragamuffins dare to contradict her. Oppo stood with his head bowed, as if expecting a blow. Her frantic screams were deafening. She loomed over him like a mountain about to collapse. He honestly didn't understand what she was talking about. Who was she to listen to her? The old lady suddenly calmed down. Apparently her sudden mood swings were a consequence of illness or age. She spoke with pity about her long illness and how long it took her to recover, without the ability to help them, and her poor unfortunate grandchildren were forced to fight for their survival. She had changed completely, and the boy became worried. But she stood and looked at them, completely calm, with her eyes full of tears, trying not to let them roll down her cheeks. She held up well and decided to let the children go swimming and went in search of some food for dinner. The children watched her go, showing their agreement to the terms. Having set their minds to bathing and wanting to discuss what was happening, they waited until she had calmed down enough. As soon as the woman walked away, the girls began to fussily discuss who this woman was, what she was doing here, and why she decided that they were her grandchildren. One of the girls suggested that perhaps it was just a crazy grandmother whose thoughts were all mixed up because of her age. The youngest asked Oppo if it wasn't really their real grandmother. There was hope in her voice that someone else was taking care of her. Someone from the adults of her real family. Oppo looked at her, trying to squeeze out an answer to her question. He knew how important it was to her and how upset she might be if he told her the truth. The older girls shared their thoughts and discontent. They did not see their grandmother in her, and completely outraged, thought that this crazy old granny had simply made the wrong home when she was going to her own. Yusong, trying to understand, spoke about the facts of what happened. After all, this woman took care of them. She brought and boiled water for them so that they could wash and warm up. And now she went to look for clothes for them and dinner. Appo reassured and encouraged his little sister by saying that he would buy everything they needed and that she shouldn't worry about it. Yusong in her brother's arms didn't understand why he was saying this. She was glad that someone would take care of them and tried to object. One of the children interrupted her and shouted that she should not be a fool and not hope for someone's help. After all, the old woman had left and was unlikely to return to them. Their conversations were interrupted by a question from their grandmother, who had returned from her search. She had returned to them, although no one thought that she would come back. In her hands were bundles with something. On her head were some blankets or clothes. All the children turned their heads in her direction, not believing their eyes. They didn't even have time to completely tidy themselves up, and she not only returned but also with the promised dinner and clothes for them. The woman ordered that everything she had brought be taken into the house, and the children jumped up and hurried to free the old woman's chickens and see what was in those bundles. Now light was pouring out from the ruined hut where the children lived. Although the windows and doors were broken, the roof had slid down and crumbled in places. The walls had split into large cracks, but the atmosphere had become more cozy and homely. Inside, everyone was sitting at dinner. The children were happy. Although they still did not understand what this woman was doing here and treated her with distrust, the warm dinner managed to calm them down and relax them a little. The old woman smiled and asked the younger ones not to hurry, because the food would not disappear from their plate. But they were so hungry that they could hardly restrain themselves. The elders kept themselves aloof and ate almost nothing, still expecting a trick. The old woman saw them and persuaded them to start eating, because they hadn't come here to watch others eat. One of the girls agreed and asked her grandmother if she would eat. After all, the old woman was just sitting and smiling as she watched her grandchildren gobble up their dinner. The old woman was touched by the girl's concern. She stroked her head and expressed gratitude for the attention to herself. The atmosphere improved, and the children gradually let go of their mistrust. The older brother watched as the younger ones trusted this woman and reached out to her and doubted that they considered her their own grandmother. He saw how Grandma was feeding Yusong and how happy the girl was. Grandma was very smiling and attentive to everyone, but he was expecting a trick. How could he confuse his own grandmother with someone else's? The whole dinner he was thinking about whether he could trust this old woman. Was there any danger threatening them? From the darkness of the forest, two people stood and looked at the crumbling hut. They listened to the voices that reached them and simply waited. They were talking quietly about how they had finally found this house. They were finally there and were grinning at each other. One of them said that he had noticed her at the market. She had spent a lot of money on food and clothes, and he had guessed where she might go with all the goods she had bought. Here. After all, her 5 poor grandchildren lived here. The second one was very shocked that there were 5 children. His eyebrows slightly rose in great surprise, and his eyes noticeably widened. Having seen and heard what was said, he immediately made it clear to his partner that he did not want to get dirty in children's blood, and therefore was very upset about the current situation. The second one reassured his brother partner that he could do all the dirty work himself, and that he should not worry or be concerned about anything. The first one laughed. His brother, who decided to make the job easier by taking everything on himself, was almost half his height and weight. He laughed and laughed, thinking how all this could be done. They all stood at a distance, all watching the hut, deciding to let the children and the old woman enjoy their last supper. Showing a kind of generosity, they waited for the right time to attack. Meanwhile, the children were going to bed. A candle was burning on a stand, illuminating the entire room. Blankets were spread out on the floor, and there were pillows. The children were very happy to settle into such beautiful beds. Yusong, who was lying in bed, was worried and asked her brother why their grandmother had disappeared again and had not returned. The girl quickly became attached to the old woman and wanted the old woman to stay with them. Appa reassured the girl that she would be back soon. She just went to light a fire, and Yusong needed to go to sleep and didn't have to worry about anything. Yusong was being naughty and didn't want to sleep without her grandmother and still couldn't calm down. The brother kept arguing with his sister, trying to get her to go to bed. He threatened her by saying that her grandmother had told her to go to bed early, but she still wasn't sleeping. The little girl would start to have hysterics. She was afraid that her grandmother would leave her while she was sleeping, so she would only sleep when she returned and lay down with her. All the other older children looked at each other and did not know how to calm their little sister. They told her not to dare think about such a thing. Grandmother would not abandon them and would be with them again very soon. Suddenly a voice was heard from the street. It became clear that someone had approached the hut because the grandmother, with obvious belligerence, demanded that the strangers introduce themselves. The woman stood with a basin in her hands and could only make out the silhouettes of people hidden in the thick fog. She, in a hostile mood, repeatedly demanded that the approaching strangers introduce themselves. As if they had gone deaf, they walked silently and very confidently. Two men came out of the fog. One was tall and large, and the other was exactly half as big with a very unpleasant, sarcastic face. They mockingly noticed the loud, dissatisfied voice of the old woman and began to laugh. Hearing the screams, all the children ran out into the street and were horrified by what they saw. The younger girls ran straight into their clothes and wrapped themselves tightly in them from the fear that had rolled over them. Oppo stood in front, slightly covering his sisters with his body. Ahead of them stood the grandmother, and in front of her towered two men clearly unfriendly. They had sabers visible at their belts. The grandmother looked worried, and the unexpected guests smiled maliciously. Grandma hissed angrily that the guests apparently weren't going to answer the question asked and were having fun talking some nonsense. The larger one also mockingly introduced himself as Wang Sam, a member of Il Simdan. He was very amused by something, as he was laughing and smiling all the time, but it was impossible to understand what exactly. The children, repeating his name out loud, huddled together even more. They guessed who it was, but they had no idea what this Wang Sam was doing on their doorstep with his partner. Yusong whined that she was very scared and clung to her older sister even tighter. She in turn tried to calm the little girl down, asking her not to worry and promising that everything would be fine. She took her sister in her arms and hugged her tightly, trying to console her. Wang Sam grinned, pleased with how his name frightened the children. He looked at the children as if they were prey, frightening them even more. His hyena-like partner praised him by saying that there was no person who did not know this name and did not tremble before it. Grandmother, proudly, without showing a drop of fear, was indignant that such a bastard as Wang Sam was doing here, near their house, and how dare he come here and scare the children. The big guy didn't expect such insults, and his faithful little dog in the role of a brother began to yelp. How dare this old woman throw such insults at his brother? It was too noticeable that this phrase hit the pride of both of them. Appa stood there not knowing how to help. He only called out to his grandmother without saying anything else. He was afraid, but he was ready to act if necessary. He was a very brave young man, perhaps braver than the two of them despite his young age. The grandmother asked the children to stay behind her and reassured them that she could figure everything out herself. The men hesitated as if deliberately prolonging this moment, but they were surprised by the courage and confidence of this weak grandmother. Wang Sam swung his sword at the old woman, saying that she was completely out of her mind to be so confident that she could handle the two of them. The grandmother did not flinch, only became more angry at the impudence and complete lack of any holiness of men who wanted to harm innocent children. She made it clear that she would teach them a lesson, clenching her fists. She stood waiting to rush into battle. Wang Sam kept swinging his sword, not understanding what she was saying. How could she do anything with it? The old woman was out of her mind to say such things. The smirk on her face said something else. She understood what she was saying and was quite confident in her abilities. She continued to insult her offenders, on the contrary, trying to anger them even more. Humanly, apparently, they did not understand, so there was no other way. Wang Sam got tired of listening and swung his sword furiously, angrily ordering the old woman to shut up. Alpa shouted at his grandmother, trying to influence what was happening. The sisters turned away and shouted. The sword touched the neck and passed through without harming the old woman. The blade passed through as if through fog, and the old woman continued to look at Wang Sam. The children continued to scream. The girls hugged each other and closed their eyes. Appa stood there, dumbfounded by what he was seeing. It was unlikely that he would have been able to do anything if he had managed to run forward. Wang Sam, pleased with what he had done, mocked the old woman and promised that he would spend her money carefully so that the one he had just killed would not worry. Oppa began to cry. What he and his sisters had waited for so long was cut short before it could take root. Despite his mistrust of her, he was very glad that someone had appeared who could take care of them. Then they heard their grandmother's voice, asking them discontentedly why they were crying. because she was more alive than anyone else. The children could not see her. They could assume that their grandmother had become a ghost. They turned their heads and tried to find the source of her voice. Those two killers also heard the old woman's voice and turned around in panic, twisting their heads and shouting what was happening and why they were hearing her voice. From the illuminated area of the holes, the grandmother appeared. Her eyes were sparkling, and her face was twisted with anger. The two brothers cried out at what they saw. The children were happy that their grandmother was alive and called out to her with joyful cries. They almost jumped up and down with happiness, not paying attention to all the oddities. The grandmother, leaning on a broom, shamed the big guy by saying that he couldn't even swing a sword properly and was also planning to rob and dispose of the spoils. The mercenaries couldn't understand how she could survive. One screamed that she was a ghost in such fear that it was impossible to imagine. They froze in horror and bewilderment. Everything happened very quickly. Grandma's movements could not be tracked. Everything around began to rush and shine. She seemed to rise above the ground and ask for help from lightning, so that it would punish them for their sins. Everything sparkled and began to rush about even more intensely. A storm arose at the woman's feet. All that was visible was a broom, around which brightly shining lightning bolts were spinning, eager to quickly deal with the offenders. Wang Sam whined that he couldn't move. There was horror in his eyes now. He was facing his punishment, but he apparently didn't realize it. How could this old woman master martial arts and do such a thing? Just a moment. These two deserved it. For everything they had done, they should have been punished more severely. They didn't even have time to understand what had happened before they lost consciousness. An old woman stood near the prostrate offenders and complained about how old she had become. The children looked at her in complete surprise, and the old woman, who looked very weak, was absolutely calm. Appa came closer, called out by her request. He looked at the lying men, then turned his gaze to the grandmother. Granny asked her grandson to bring her old things, because despite all the bad things these people have done, they should be delivered with dignity to where they belong, and to show at least a little bit of not so much respect, but simply a duty to do everything right. Appa didn't understand and doubted whether it was necessary to do this. Don't such people deserve to die if they wish it on others, he thought. The grandmother became dissatisfied with her grandson's behavior. Was he a girl, not a young man? She reproached him for his weakness and instructed him to be stronger and braver. He stood there in shame, listening to what he himself knew. He is the head of the family. He must be firm and decisive in his actions, because he is responsible for taking care of his sisters. Fear only gets in the way, and he must stop being afraid and doubting everything around him. He looked at his terrified sisters, who were also looking at him for support and protection. They looked weak, and yes, they needed protection. One of the older girls asked him what he would do when all his relatives and this old woman died. After all, he would have to do everything himself, which shamed him even more in front of himself and the other girls. He just stood there silently, thinking over everything he had heard addressed to him. He didn't know what to say or how he could justify himself. He gathered his courage and loudly, confidently assured everyone that he would protect them all, that he was not weak and could do anything. He knew that he really had no other choice. He had to do what he had to do. Grandma sped everyone up, calling for it all to be over quickly. The children nodded in support, as if this whole situation had changed them completely. It didn't take them long to get to the city, to the right place where they should leave the attackers. The city was empty. The moon lit the streets very well, helping the lanterns. Only the wheels of the cart broke this silence. The guards were not expecting to meet anyone at all. They looked at everyone with their eyes wide open and asked who had been brought here and why. The grandmother, who supported Wang Sam, said that the two attacked her and her children, that they were captured and now they brought them here for questioning. The guard asked the children if they had caught them, and that their offenders looked like some kind of petty thieves and did not look at all intimidating. One of the girls, hesitantly but proudly, said that their grandmother had been able to do all of this on her own. Everyone else stood silently, making it clear that it was true. The grandmother turned to the guard, shifting responsibility for these two daredevils to the guard. It was already very late and also very cold, and it was time to go home. They deserved to be punished, and that's how it should be. She handed Wang Sam and his brother over to the guards, gathered the children, and walked away. The guards stood there thinking about the old woman and these poor children. Most likely they lived with her, and they had no parents. He felt very sorry for this family and watched them until they disappeared from sight. Turning to these two, calling them bastards, he tried to find out how they dared to attack these people. Didn't they have any conscience and regret? The guard didn't understand who you have to be to do something like that. Wang Sam, who had already arrived and was even standing on his feet, introduced himself. His brother could barely stand next to him and was already silent. Apparently, he got it well since he didn't want to laugh and make fun of anyone. The guard, not believing what he heard, asked again, was that even possible? He repeated again that he was Wang Sam from Il-Simdan and was surprised that he was not recognized. His brother introduced himself as So-Hong Kwok. Their battered faces and tattered appearances did not match the names they had said. The guard, still not believing his eyes and ears, looked at them, only repeating what he had heard. He could not understand how that old woman could deal with them, and what had happened there. Wang Sam announced that the old woman apparently had some martial arts, and no one expected that. That's why it happened the way it did, watching the children and the woman leave into the distance. They went further and further. They were almost invisible, and behind their backs they were promised revenge. After all, the leader of those to whom they brought Wang Sam and So-Hong Kwok would never forgive them for this. The sun was already rising, dispersing the night's cold and worries. A new day, a new life was beginning. The hut stood in complete silence and calm, as if it had forgotten what had happened the night before. The peace was broken by children's cries calling for their grandmother. The other children also woke up from the cries of their younger sister. Jumping up in surprise, everyone turned their gaze to the little girl. Yusong sat and cried in her bed. There was no sign of her grandmother. She thought that the old woman had disappeared, or maybe even abandoned them. She had become so attached to her and wanted to live with her. The children looked at the exit of the hut and listened through Yusong's sobs. Yes, indeed, there was no one else here. Both the house and the street were completely quiet, and there was nothing to confirm the presence of Granny. Oppa immediately thought about it. It seemed suspicious to him that Grandma wasn't home at such an early hour. She didn't warn them that she was going somewhere, and here she just disappeared. Memories from the night before flashed before his eyes. They were walking home from the city after that terrible fight. The stars covered the dark sky, making it glow brightly and light their way. How they asked their grandmother if she was going to suddenly disappear, just like their mother did to their father. Granny carried Yusong on her shoulders and assured them with a sweet smile that she would not disappear anywhere. After all, she couldn't abandon them all. She couldn't leave them all alone again. The little girl squealed with joy and asked the same thing over and over again. She asked to promise that she would not abandon them, and Grandma promised and laughed heartily with everyone else. The little girl hugged the woman tighter and looked happier than she had in a long time. This memory was slowly fading before the young man's eyes. Appa sat with his head bowed low, lost in thought. He couldn't accept such a betrayal. After all, she had promised to be there. He believed that this woman could become a grandmother to them and wanted to trust. The sobbing was interrupted by a familiar but no longer offensive name-calling. Granny appeared on the threshold with a whole mountain of plates on a tray in her hands. In bewilderment, she asked why they were crying since early morning. Yusong jumped up with a shout and threw herself into her grandmother's arms. The other children, who had already believed that she would not appear again, looked on in surprise as the little girl hurried to meet her. She jumped with a running start and hung on the woman's dresses, not paying attention to the table that the granny was holding in her hands. The granny laughed, affectionately calling her an elephant and asking her to be careful because she could knock over the table with the food. Appa ran up and tried to take the table in his hands, while the little girl happily did not come off her grandmother. If it had been a little bit longer, the old woman would definitely not have been able to hold so much. The sun had already risen and illuminated the entire yard, penetrating through holes in the roof and walls and illuminating the house from within. The singing of birds and the rustling of grass tried to disperse the still-standing fog, which seemed to have no intention of disappearing anywhere. The children devoured their breakfast with gusto, slurping and groaning with pleasure. The grandmother combed the girl's hair, smoothing it down carefully. Appa watched what was happening, thinking that it turned out that he could really trust this woman as if she were his own grandmother. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he also wanted it very much. He wanted to have a family, to have a parent who would take care of them and be supportive. After breakfast, everyone went about their business and told Granny about their lives. It was quiet around the hut. There was no longer any danger threatening this place. This silence was broken by a reproachful question about how children beg and why they do it. The grandmother was surprised, upset, and very unhappy with what she heard from her children. Appo and the eldest sister stood silently, burning with shame, and did not know what to answer. Grandma asked them not to do this anymore because it was bad and completely humiliating. It would be better if they went to work, because they were young and healthy and could already find something to suit their abilities. The sister tried to justify herself by saying that she and her brother had once tried to sell the brushwood they had collected. Oppo was silent, and the grandmother was interested in what had come of it. Displeasure remained on her face. Oppo and his sister immediately transported themselves to that day and tried to tell their grandmother everything as it happened. Before their eyes flashed a huge foot, trampling the twigs that the children had spent so long collecting and dragging to the market. They were scolded by two big guys for not being allowed to sell wooden things without permission to do so. They insulted and threatened the children, and they didn't know this. They stood there and apologized many times while these bastards trampled their work. One of them decided that cursing would not be enough and hit Oppo so hard that he flew off. The girl still remembered the horror she felt at that moment. The second one joined the first one. They beat the guy, saying that now they will know and remember well what is allowed and what is not. And from the moment Oppo lay beaten in the arms of his crying sister above him, it was decided that Oppo would beg. At least it was safer, and there was no other way out because everyone had to be fed somehow. The children stood in front of their grandmother, tears streaming down their cheeks. They had no choice, and Oppo was forced to go and beg for money. The old woman, pursing her lips in regret and holding back her tears, calmed the children. Now they had her, and they would no longer have to risk and humiliate themselves by begging people for anything. She promised that she would sort everything out. Wiping away tears and trying to calm down, they said that they believed her, and they really did. Here she changed abruptly again and reproached them for what they were worth. She began to send them off again to gather brushwood for sale. The children looked at her in bewilderment, but deciding not to argue and trust, Oppo agreed to carry out this task. They all moved into the forest together. Each one carefully selected good branches that could be sold. Yusong ran around her brother and sisters and grandmother in her games. Appa was ready to chop even large branches, but there was no axe. Grandmother assured him that brushwood would be enough. After all, even if they had an axe, no one would have enough strength to chop such branches. He doubted that they would be able to sell only brushwood after that unsuccessful experience. Grandma taught him that different fires require different branches and that what they collect, people will still buy, because there will be those who need their branches. Appo still listened with doubts and tried to object. But the grandmother remained silent, thereby assuring him that he should cast aside all doubts and listen to her. While the children were busy with their assigned work, the grandmother watched them and thought about her own. Looking at Appo, she saw only purity and innocence in her. There was not a drop of evil in him like in most of the people of this world. His eyes shone with kindness and sincerity. A special path awaited him. She wondered what made him become like this. Perhaps it was the responsibility that fell on him for his family. After all, it was necessary to find the best and safest ways to feed them. They often faced injustice and evil from others. The only problem was his short-sightedness. It had caused problems for their family in the past and could cause problems in the future. Appo always thought only about today, and he thought it was right. It was hard for him. And by accepting the uncertainty of the next day, and as if inventing a new adventure, it was easier for him to encourage his sisters and himself. Grandma called him to listen to her for a while. Appo looked happy and his eyes were still shining as always. Grandma told him about small and great people, about the strength of the great and the weakness of the small. Because of their weakness, the latter do not see much, and this creates great problems for them, and they live without understanding their mistakes and without understanding this world. Appo tried to understand what his grandmother was talking about. He could hear her talking about little people who just floated along with the flow without raising their heads. He didn't want to associate that with himself. He didn't think he was one of those people. Grandmother continued and spoke about the great ones. They know and see everything. They understand both the world on earth and the world in heaven. They understand the rules. She came closer to the young man. Taking his hand, she asked him to close his eyes. The young man shuddered, not expecting to be touched. He closed his eyes and waited for the next instructions. Grandma asked only if he felt the wind, to which she answered positively. She said that the wind was bending around him and laughing at him. She asked him to concentrate. She wanted to hear if her grandson felt the direction of the wind and how the branch in front of him trembled in this wind. She talked about God above the clouds, about the heavens. Appo stood and yes, he felt everything his grandmother was telling him. He stood and enjoyed the new sensations, how the sun warmed his skin and the wind cooled it. He wondered how he hadn't noticed it before. Grandma asked him to open his eyes. He opened them, and his eyes were filled with delight. An incredible view opened up before him. A snow-covered valley decorated with various types of trees and bushes. The well-trodden track of the road teased him to follow it. The guy smiled and was delighted. He wondered how he could not see this before. After all, it was always before his eyes. He just walked and did not notice this beauty. Grandma was there looking at him tenderly, smiling. This was his world now. She had shown him what she had to. He looked at her with great gratitude for what he saw. He was happy and amazed. They stood and talked, looking at the blue expanse of the sky. Granny continued her story. She taught that strong people differ from weak ones by their actions. The former always overshadow the others until the weak ones begin to change something and act differently. Appo listened carefully to the old woman, trying to understand as best he could what she was saying. If he wanted to achieve enlightenment, he had to synchronize his breathing with the breathing of this world. Only then would he be able to get all the answers he wanted. The woman led him by the arm, continuing to talk. In the end, she told him that sooner or later, her advice would help him a lot. Help him reach the heavens. Suddenly, the grandmother stopped and stared. She thought questioningly to herself, who is she telling all this to? She stood with her eyes closed and was completely immersed in her thoughts. Appo, concerned about her condition, tried to call her. He asked if everything was okay with her, what had happened, but she continued to stand silently. She heard the voice of some child but did not understand who he was or where she was. Appo continued to shout at her, shaking her hand with all his might. Without expecting it, the woman looked at him in fear, her mouth open, but she was too frightened to say anything. The man who turned her away apologized. She just looked a lot like the one he was looking for. There was another guy standing nearby who just stood there and looked at her with displeasure. The woman hurried away, overwhelmed by such an address to herself. One of those men lamented that he would soon go mad from this search. How much more time would he have to kill before he managed to find her? The second one, with the same dissatisfied look, lamented that their master was losing time and patience every day. They needed to find her, even if they had to turn the whole world upside down. It was their duty, and they were obliged to do it as quickly as possible. The children stood around the frozen grandmother. They shouted, called her, and shook her, but she did not respond and remained motionless. Appo hugged his grandmother and kept waiting for her to answer. He held her hand as tightly as he could, afraid to let go. And his grandmother looked with great incomprehension at the strange boy who called her his grandmother. Granny still looked puzzled and was silent, her face twisted. One of her eyebrows crawled somewhere high up. It seemed that she was about to simply turn around and go her own way. She saw 5 worried and crying children in front of her. They all kept looking at her and called her grandma, and she was only concerned about whose they were and what they were doing here and why they were bothering her. Grandma shuddered and gasped again, freezing for another moment, as if someone had switched her consciousness with some mechanism. Immediately after this switching, the old woman began to dig into why the smallest one was crying and what had happened to them, all that they were standing there and looking at her so strangely. The children were shouting happily. They still called her grandma and asked if she was okay. Their faces were beaming with smiles. The grandmother was surprised, as if something could be wrong with her, and asked why they were standing there instead of collecting brushwood. And one of the sisters suggested in response that their grandmother must have fallen ill since she was behaving very strangely. Suddenly, she started shouting at them very loudly and scolding them for influencing their work and standing like idols looking at her. She ordered them to quickly continue their work with such a shout that it was probably heard throughout the entire forest. The children quickly ran to collect brushwood, hearing their grandmother's shouts after them that she was watching them and that they should not even dare to slack off. There were 8 people walking along the city street. 2 of them, the very first ones, were apparently higher in status than the others. There was no one else on the street, and only their steps and conversation broke the silence. The conversation was about a woman. The man said that the worst thing was that she had plum disease. He knew rumors that she spoke terrible Cantonese. Based on this, he thought that she could be found here. Another gentleman replied that he had already contacted his man, and if she really spoke Cantonese, they would be able to find her quickly. The second asked if that would really help. The first one said that he was very surprised that there were so many people who used this dialect. In Hagwonsong alone, there were more than 20 elderly women who spoke it. One of them asked if there were any women among these who had no relatives. The second answered that there were a couple of suitable women. The first asked the other to let his man go, as they had very little time. He said he would go there personally. The other suggested Chung Li Bim, suggesting that he was ideal for the job. He became embarrassed and asked again if he really wanted to send Chong Li Bim on this mission, doubting this man. Another one operated on the fact that Chong Li Bima was one of them, thus convincing that he should cope, and it was a good idea. The first admitted that the proposed man was quite fast and had served them faithfully for 8 years. But unfortunately, he was not very proactive, and this was a problem. But he still agreed to send this man so as not to waste time, which was already very short, only so that everything would be as fast as possible. The other agreed with him. At the same time, he asked how things were going with the search for the bloody Magog. The second one asked again, in surprise. He asked why he was so worried about this because they disappeared 50 years ago. It was a thing of the past. The second one barked loudly at him and called him an idiot. He was very angry at this attitude. The other gentleman did not expect this at all, and his eyes widened. The first one continued to shout that he probably forgot about the body they found in Ganbuk. Their master said that it was definitely a member of the bloody Magog. How dare he even doubt the wisdom of their master? The second one started making excuses and denied what was said. He said that most of their people were busy looking for the master's mother, so there was simply no strength left for this investigation. He asked not to get worked up since they would start the investigation as soon as they could. As he walked away, completely furious, the first man warned that if they returned, all the Justice faction fighters would have to move. The second remained standing in place, silently watching his partner leave. The market was as lively as always. Many buyers were choosing the goods they needed, and the sellers were shouting out their offers louder. A bundle of brushwood fell on one of the unoccupied places. All the branches were one-to-one, carefully selected. A young man selling firewood nearby looked in surprise at the old woman who had thrown her branches nearby. The woman looked down at him with a very unpleasant expression on her face and asked him to move over so that she could sell her wood and earn some money for bread. The guy, hearing her speech, grimaced because the dialect was terrible. and said that he did not understand what she wanted from him, and calmly continued to sit in his place. Appa approached the salesman and more politely asked him to move just a little, and their family would be very grateful to him for this act. The boy politely agreed and stood up, trying to push his goods away. Appa examined and compared the firewood with the brushwood his family had collected, and the grandmother stood and looked at them from the same positions. She sat down next to him and very sweetly said what a wonderful young man the salesman was, and asked that God bless him, smiling as if she hadn't been rude to him a few minutes ago. The old woman called the children to her. The girls ran together with smiles to their grandmother. She told them and taught them how to properly offer goods and sell them. She said that it was useless to shout at the top of your lungs to everyone you meet. Since not everyone came for firewood, you only need to shout to someone who is dressed in thin clothes. Yu Song, the youngest of the sisters, volunteered for the job, but her grandmother said that she shouldn't do it because she was too young for it. And she also said that the elder should do this, and pointed her finger at the elder brother. Appo happily asked if it was him. The grandmother suggested to her grandson that she could do it if he didn't want to, but he volunteered and said that he could and would do it. Appo walked through the market, anxiety taking hold of him. He looked around at all the stalls of traders and ordinary simple people who were simply sitting on the ground trying to sell their goods. The girls called out to their grandmother with concern. They were very worried about their brother, but the grandmother was completely calm and confident that he would cope with everything. She said that she understood the girls' concern for their brother, but asked them to trust her and see what would happen next. Appo walked, and before his eyes flashed fragments of memories from that very time in this market, when he was beaten. He remembered everything down to the smallest detail, and he could not let it go. Lost in thought, he suddenly stopped and gasped. Near one of the tents, two very small children were sitting on the floor, and next to them lay a pile of brushwood. No one seemed to notice these little ones in this market. They were so similar to her and her sister. They used to sit unnoticed near their little pile of brushwood that they had spent so long collecting. He watched them for a long time, completely forgetting where he was going and where he was. He compared them with himself, and himself with them, deeply immersed in these thoughts. He was brought to his senses by his grandmother's screams. She asked him what he was doing, why he was standing there, and told him to look in the direction indicated. She shouted that more woodcutters were heading this way and asked reproachfully why there were so many of them here. He looked at two healthy men with a huge number of branches behind their backs. One was slightly fit and much taller than his friend, who was shorter and heavier. The boy was taken aback by what he saw. He gasped and tried to say at least something, but because of his excitement, he couldn't do it well. He recognized them. They were the same people who had beaten him up for his trade here. The boy just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. The eldest of the sisters ran up to their grandmother, trying to tell her the same thing that her brother had tried, but she was too nervous to finish. The grandmother couldn't understand what was wrong and asked the girl what had scared her so much. She looked at these big guys and began to guess what was going on. She asked the girl if these were the same bastards who beat up her eldest grandson. The girl was silent. Grandmother asked her not to worry so much when the old woman was on her side. After all, just one blow would be enough to send these two to count their teeth. The girl looked at her grandmother with great gratitude. Finally, a person appeared who could protect them, stand up for them. Oppo stood there, full of fear in front of these men who were confidently moving straight towards him. Grandma noticed this and realized that he was very scared. But she stood still and told the girl that in that case, she should see how small her brother's intestines were, whether he could withstand it. And the girl was worried about this and was definitely not happy with this decision. Grandma explained that fear comes from the heart. If you don't overcome your fear, then nothing will shine in this life, and they must check whether the brother has the heart of a lion or a mouse. Will he have enough courage in this situation? The girl did not understand what her grandmother meant and stared at her with her big eyes in bewilderment. The grandmother stood there smirking, explaining that she wanted to see how the girl's brother would meet these bastards. The men had come very close to Oppo and still hadn't noticed. The grandmother, watching closely, told the girl that she didn't know if he could handle them, but if he wanted to protect his family, he had to learn to overcome his fears. The men stared at the boy, glaring at him. They were definitely 3 times bigger than the boy and looked like they were ready to tear apart everyone in their path. And Oppo was standing right in his way, unable to move from his place out of fear. He heard his grandmother's question about whether he was afraid, and this brought him back to his senses a little. She asked him if everything was okay and said that he would have to deal with these bastards. She warned him that no matter what happened, she would not be able to help him and he had to cope on his own. Oppo stood there, ready to run away. He tried to justify himself to her, wanted to say that he couldn't handle it, wanted to find a bunch of reasons to be able to not stand there. He was sure that these two would beat him up again. The memories of that incident were all that was spinning in his head, and his body seemed to remember all that pain. Grandma started getting angry. She asked him what would happen if she helped him now. She wouldn't protect him forever, and what would he do without her? Who could he ask for help? He had to rely only on himself. They came very close, and Appa whined, asking his grandmother for help. Behind him, a question was heard about who he was. The boy froze, expecting the worst. The big guys stood very self-confidently, waiting for an answer. One of them repeated his question loudly and irritably. Was the boy deaf and couldn't answer, standing with his back to them and keeping silent? Oppo, turning his head only slightly, mumbled something to himself, not daring to turn around to face them completely. The big guy suddenly froze when he saw someone and began to look closely, already forgetting about the boy. The old woman looked at him with recognition, and the 4 children stood around her with frightened looks, but he did not particularly notice their presence. He was interested in this particular old lady, and he inquired about her. He was very interested in who she was. Oppo replied that it was his grandmother, waiting to see what would happen next. Straz still wouldn't let him go. The big guy started to be surprised and indignant that they were selling wood here. This old woman and this kid decided to trade here. His face was very distorted with discontent. The second one, ready to fight, began to inquire whether this family knew who they were. They were irreplaceable woodcutters, and since they deliver wood to Muchang, all the wood trade in this market is under their jurisdiction. Oppo stood and mumbled something to himself, afraid to utter a word. The big guy, enraged, slapped the young man with all his might because he was muttering something to himself. Oppo's sister screamed, afraid for her brother. She stood clutching her face, not knowing what to do. She was crying, but she screamed warningly that the big guy shouldn't dare touch her brother. She would have run to them long ago, but her grandmother held her, blocking the way with her hand. One of the bastards hissed that he remembered the girl and that she was with a guy that day, and that was very hard to forget. He stood and laughed at Oppo and his sister. The second big guy was yelling at Oppo that apparently they didn't beat him up enough back then, and now he's brought the old woman with him too, and apparently he needs to explain everything more clearly. He swung his arm, getting ready to strike again. The second one, with a laugh, told the first one to take it easy, because the old woman was looking at them and he should look at her. He pointed his finger at the granny and looked in the direction with the other. The children were ready to rush and tear them apart, if their grandmother had not held them back. Their elder sister most of all. Granny stood and watched silently what was happening. The older girl, with tears on her cheeks, was about to jump out from behind her grandmother's hand and rush at them. The big guy asked what his friend thought about the girl as if he was frightened by her confident appearance. He replied that he was thinking the same thing and smiled maliciously. They began to laugh loudly and mock their observers. One told Oppo that if his grandmother was here, they would spare him. But there was a catch to it. But he warned that it was only today, and he could even trade freely, and they wouldn't take a penny from him for it. Oppo stood there and didn't understand what the catch was. He saw the offender hanging next to him. He told him that the Oppo family should be grateful to them for their compliance and generosity. The second one chuckled and looked somewhere to the side. He saw those same little children with brushwood. He began to lament about what a strange day it was and wondered why there were so many street children at the market today. Oppo turned sharply to the children, immediately realizing what was about to happen. He groaned to himself, begging them not to touch them. The children sat huddled together, unaware of what was about to happen. The man approached the children, stepping as loudly as the sound of a falling boulder. He began to roar and ask the children what they were doing there, so small, hanging over them with his whole body. The children cowered in fear and justified themselves by saying that they just wanted to make a little money from their wood. He started yelling at them for daring to sell something here and why they decided they could do that. Oppo shrank and was very upset. He didn't know how to help the kids. He watched sideways as the big guy was about to beat them up, but did nothing. The younger girl cried very loudly, and the older child, almost falling to the ground from fear, said that their mother was sick and they needed to somehow pay for the medicine. The man shouted that he didn't care and kicked the older boy with all his might, sending him flying. Oppo stood in his place, hearing the little girl's screams and sobs for her brother. The big guy swore at the children and shouted that he should never see them here again. The grandmother, who was watching everything, couldn't take it anymore. She said that she couldn't stand and just watch anymore. She had never seen such scumbags who could beat up little children without a care. Behind the bastard's back, requests could be heard for him to stop and let the children go, but he kept hitting and hitting the children, not wanting to stop. The children huddled on the floor and tried to protect themselves from the blows. The eldest covered his younger sister as much as possible. Suddenly the blows stopped, but they did not dare to open their eyes. The blows never came, and the children opened their eyes to see what was happening. The grandmother and children looked in surprise somewhere behind the offender's back, clearly not expecting what they saw. The big guy didn't stop, and she swung again, but she couldn't land a blow. Something grabbed his hand, and it got stuck in the air. Oppo stood in front of him, yelling at him to stop. He held his hand, not letting him hit him again. For him, Oppo was not an obstacle, and he just laughed and said that the boy seemed to have the brains of a chicken since he decided to interfere. The second guy stood there and mockingly nodded that the guy must have gone stupid while he stood there and spat out blood from his beatings. He kept his arms crossed over his chest and didn't care about anything at all. The one who was holding Oppo told the boy that if he let go of his hand, he would be allowed to live, and was sure that the boy would get scared and let go. Oppo stood silently, did not move from his place, and continued to hold his hand, not giving him the opportunity to beat the children again. Inside, he calmed himself down and repeated that he was not afraid of this man, thus encouraging himself. The grandmother looked contentedly at her grandson, who finally started doing something and fighting his fear. And she waited. His sisters kept their eyes on him and prayed for everything to end well for him. They were very worried that he wouldn't be able to cope with such a huge and angry man. The big guy yelled that he would definitely kill Oppo now and swung his other hand, hitting the guy. Oppo stood his ground, holding the bastard's other hand and dodging the fists flying at him. They got into a fight. Oppo couldn't dodge the blows for long and still got hit. Everything happened very quickly, and it was impossible to understand what exactly was going on in the fight. The big guy knocked Oppo to the ground with another blow. He was not only bigger by a factor of 1, but also stronger than the unprepared youth. The guy slid across the ground. The older sister screamed and wanted to rush to her brother's aid again, but the grandmother held her and did not let her do it. She wanted him to cope with it himself, to resolve the situation himself. The children begged the old woman to save their brother. They cried, tugged at her dress and hands, but she still did not go to help Oppo. She only said that of course she would save him, but continued to stand and watch carefree. The children shouted at her to come to his aid already because he would be badly wounded. They cried loudly and hoped so much that their brother would be saved from further blows. Grandma said it wasn't time for that yet and continued to stand. She was waiting for the right moment, and she knew she had to give Oppo the right time to get stronger. The children did not understand why she was doing this and tried to object to her, surrounding her from all sides. They were so worried about him that they themselves were ready to go to his aid, if it could help. The woman explained to them over and over that she would save him when it was needed and asked them to wait a little and be patient. They stood and watched as the big guy dealt blow after blow to the lying guy. The man did not feel sorry for him and said that it was a kind of test, and the boy had to pass it. His friend just stood there. He did not participate in this massacre, but he was still in the same boat. Finally, the man stopped, deciding that this was enough for the boy's brain to fall into place, and he would understand what he could and could not do. He stood and stretched his hands as if they were not damaged at all. He looked down menacingly, his eyes flashing like lightning into the sky. He looked at the children, who still hadn't let go of each other's embrace. They looked in fear at the tall man who had just beaten them and their protector and were afraid to move. The man scratched his head in confusion and told the boys that they, too, should understand what happens if they are going to do business without the knowledge and permission of these two important merchants. Again, something distracted him and he flinched from the touch and turned to find out. Oppo was back on his feet, bloodied and exhausted, but with great confidence in his eyes. He grabbed the merchant's hand. He growled at the big one that enough was enough and it was time to stop torturing the weak. He was no longer afraid, and he was ready to do a lot to protect himself and others. The man mumbled that he felt sorry for the guy, but he was asking for trouble again. He had not expected such impudence and disobedience, and his eyes flashed with rage again. Oppo jumped up sharply and hit the bastard right in the face with all his strength, so hard that he threw his head far to the side. Oppo asked with a gleam in his eyes and a mocking tone how it was, and whether he liked getting it in return. The guy's face was all bloody, in abrasions and wounds, but now he looked very cheerful and lively and smiled broadly at the enemy. The merchant, holding the place where he had been hit, asked the guy what he had just done. He considered it a great impudence and did not understand why the guy was asking for more trouble. After all, he would not be able to win this fight. Oppo saw the reaction to his punch and the smile fell off his face. He realized that it didn't work and he only got into more trouble. He gathered all his strength and got ready. He knew that he had no right to retreat now and had to fight to the end. He thought about it and his strength grew. But he didn't have time to do anything, and he got hit. He was again carried back with great force, and he began to land on the ground. The big guy, growing even more enraged, began to strike again and shout that he didn't care how young the boy was. He had to know who the Konbogu from the tree farm were and not cross them again. He shouted that he didn't care and that the guy was going to die now, and continued to pound him with his fists on everything he could get his hands on. Oppo was lying there, already badly beaten and only covering his head. He could no longer get up and understood that he would not be able to protect himself. His eyes were slightly open and he saw only flickering shadows and felt the subsequent blows on his body. And I saw those little children who watched in horror as he was beaten. He shifted his gaze from place to place, almost losing consciousness. He didn't even have the strength to keep his eyes open or even slightly defend himself from the blows. He looked at his sisters and grandmother and thought that he would no longer be able to help anyone and would not be able to do anything himself if his grandmother did not help him now. And the blows kept coming. Blood splashed around and groans escaped on their own. He lay twisted on the ground and waited. But the big guy didn't stop. He hit him with his hands and kicked him, saying different things. And he said that if you know how to breathe, you can understand the laws of heaven. He was just mocking him. Oppo was carried away by his thoughts. He was almost unconscious and could only catch thoughts. Did his grandmother tell him what to do with a strong heart? He lay there and remembered what she had taught him. He tried to hear the sound of the wind and feel it on his face. It was necessary to feel and begin to breathe with him, in unison, as one whole. He lay there and tried to get in the mood, tried to catch at least a small breath of wind. It seemed like he lay there for an eternity. He was sprawled on the ground. His clothes were torn and all stained with blood. But he didn't pay attention to it and waited. And suddenly, he abruptly grabbed the offender by the leg and pulled him towards himself. He was able to turn over and tried to stand up with support. The man turned around and looked at Oppo. The guy's eyes sparkled again. They were filled with rage and again inspired confidence and invincibility. The man was taken aback. He did not understand how such a small, weak guy could get up again. After all, a minute ago, he almost gave up his soul to God. He looked at the guy in bewilderment. He was already tired of this fight and the guy's impudence. The partner, still standing in the same place, was surprised. After all, he was definitely dying, but he was still stubborn and getting into a fight. He grinned and waited with interest to see how it would all end. The big guy was getting more and more angry. He shouted at the boy that he was a scumbag and now he would just slap him and leave no trace. He jerked his legs high, preparing to simply crush the boy. Suddenly, he heard an order to stop and almost hung in the air from surprise. The old woman was rushing towards him. Her eyes were flashing lightning and her face was such that it was scary to look at. It expressed rage, stronger than any brave warrior. She hissed that if there was one more blow, the only one who would be slapped would be this man. She was approaching him very quickly and looked quite bold. The big guy stopped and didn't understand where his fear came from. After all, it was just some old woman. But the horror took hold of him and prevented him from finishing what he had started. All the people around crowded and watched what was happening. The old woman walked through the crowd ready to settle this once and for all. Both friends could not move and howled from the wave of fear that had rolled over them again. They looked at the old woman approaching them. The grandmother approached her grandson lying on the ground. She sat down next to him, took his hand, and said that he was great. She knew that he would be hurt, but he still tried his best, defending himself to the last. Suddenly, she felt something and her eyebrow went up. She started to think what it was and began to examine it more carefully. Despite being beaten so badly, his body actually looked like it was barely bruised. He had taken so many blows, but he was almost completely unharmed, except for a few scrapes and bruises. She remembered how much he got and was surprised, because she was sure that he lost a lot of blood. Even a healthy person would have a hard time recovering from this, but not this guy. She was shocked because it was impossible that a skinny brat like him, who had not studied any martial arts, could endure such a thing. She was confused as to who he was. Oppo began to come to his senses and began to whine, turning to his grandmother. Grandma suddenly yelled at him, asking why he was lying down. Had he really gone limp already? It was very unexpected after everything that had happened. She started yelling that they all needed to sell everything quickly so they could get home early and ordered everyone to get moving. And she yelled at the guy that he was pretending and ordered him to get up. Oppo obeyed, and with groans began to try to get up. Everything hurt, and it was difficult for him to do it quickly. The old woman glanced at her grandson's offenders standing to the side. Her eyes lit up, which frightened these traitors even more. She hissed that it was their turn and everything started flashing before them. The big guy stood there in horror, waiting to see what would happen to him next. One blow and the teeth fell from his mouth. All that was left was to count them. The second one screamed loudly, but everything happened so quickly that all he could do was scream and watch. Grandma dealt blow after blow, and only her friend's head, following in the direction of the blow, flashed behind her silhouette. He stood there and just thought about what kind of old woman this was who was beating a healthy man like a kitten. He understood that even if she was an old woman, she was too tough for them. The friend hurried to help the big guy, who was being mercilessly beaten by the old woman, but having made only one step and made it clear what he was going to do, she immediately heard it. The big guy was moaning from the beating. The grandmother immediately turned around at the sound of footsteps, which scared the rescuer. How could she hear everything? The old woman turned around and angrily hissed a warning that he should stand still and not interfere. Otherwise, she would definitely unscrew something from him. The second merchant, who had been standing the whole time and was more of an observer, became very scared and even opened his mouth, afraid of getting the same thing as his partner. He broke out in a cold sweat and lowered his head, clenching his fists, but did not dare to enter into a fight. Oppo had already stood up and exhaled with ease and said that a weight had been lifted from his soul. He looked very exhausted and tired. His younger sisters rushed to hug and kiss him. They were so happy that he was not hurt even more and could stand on his feet. They asked if everything was okay many times, hugging him even tighter. He hugged them back and replied that everything was fine. He smiled, and all the pain at that moment seemed to evaporate. It became easy, and how happy he was for such support. The two little ones who were also injured in this fight were sitting in the same place and hugging each other, happy that everything was over and they were relatively okay. The older one was trying hard to calm his little sister down. Oppo approached them and asked how much the baby's wounds hurt. He in turn shrank, expecting something bad, and hugged his sister tighter, protecting her. Appa leaned closer and asked if everything was okay, showing compassion and concern as if he were his own siblings. The baby, wiping away tears and feeling his abrasions, said that everything was fine. The younger sister refused to let go of her brother for even a second. Appo stood there and thought to himself that he was very glad that everything was okay. He was very worried that the children were badly hurt, and therefore he was very worried. Appo walked back to his family. He was thinking about everything that happened when he heard someone talking to him and saying that Appo should take more care of himself. Is he sure he's okay? Appo turned around and saw the guy who had actually addressed him. He said that he wanted to help, but hesitated, saying nothing more. Apo thanked him and asked not to worry about him, smiling. When Apo approached his grandmother and sisters, the grandmother said that she saw that her grandson was already standing on his feet, and that meant that everything was fine. Apo smiled back and confirmed that everything was fine. The guy who didn't have time to help was standing nearby. Looking at the beaten offender, she smiled contentedly and said that everything was correct. The guy came up to them and turned to Granny, saying that she had a wonderful grandson. Granny thanked him and boasted that he was the eldest. Apo stood silently listening to the conversation about himself. The guy expressed his thoughts that it seemed to him that Apo was badly injured and needed help and treatment. He didn't want to pry into other people's business, but he was very worried about the young man. The grandmother sternly said that everything was fine with Apo and there was nothing to worry about. And her grandson looked at her sideways, uncomprehendingly. The boy stood and watched. He wondered if she was being too strict with her grandson, especially in a situation like the one that had just happened. He was very surprised. He remembered the old woman who had given change to the bullies and wondered what could have made her like that. And he was ashamed of himself for not even asking the name of the guy who had tried so hard to protect the children when even the adults had stood aside and done nothing. The people around were really standing there carefree and indifferent, as if they hadn't seen what was happening at all. They didn't care, and they didn't want any problems for themselves. The guy came up and introduced himself. He said his name was So Young. Another one started asking about the prefix So. Was it a family name or part of a name? So Young hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He leaned on his sisters and grandmother, seeking help. Having gathered himself, he said that he and his family were orphans, which is why they did not have a last name. Then the grandmother entered the conversation and said that her grandchildren had a different surname, which greatly surprised So Young. The old lady began to apologize that she was already quite old and tried to remember the last name of her grandchildren. She tried different syllables, different last names, until she finally remembered. Their last name was Jean. Apo was shocked by what he heard. He asked inquiringly if it was really true, to which the granny replied that of course it was true, and she said that since her ancestors bore this surname, then the children could too. So Young looked happily at his grandmother and his family, beaming with happiness. The children shouted to each other. Did everyone hear it? And they joyfully jumped and screamed. They hugged each other tightly and kept repeating, "Did everyone hear it?" The older sister spoke to the youngest and explained that since she was now Jin Yonghua, she was little Jin Yu Song. The little girl jumped and repeated her full name. Their elder brother repeated the same thing, as if assuring himself that he was now Jin So Young. The width of his smile was from ear to ear. He really had acquired a family. He thought how much the grandmother had done for them, caring for them and taking care of them. Giving them shelter and food, hugging them and teaching them, she had become very close to them. Yusong finally felt motherly love and warmth. He was very grateful to her for that, and he considered the family name to be the most important thing. Now they were no longer orphans and street children. They had a parent, they had a family. He repeated loudly that his name was now Jin So Young, almost jumping for joy at this news. Lanterns hung around the perimeter of the roof but were not yet lit. The sun was just beginning to set and it was still quite light. The building was quite lively inside. People were dressed in rich, colorful attire that showed their status. The man with the wide bracelets was very angry. The earrings in his ears glittered, emphasizing his irritation. He listened to the complaints and grievances of the group of people standing in front of him. One of them said that the gentleman should kill the old woman, and if you look, the taxes from the lumberjacks market have also disappeared. The gentleman slumped in his chair and was incredulous at what he heard. He asked if they really wanted to tell him that there was an old woman there who was using the powers of a hermit to do such things. The man in the group said yes. The others stood with their eyes downcast and kept silent, giving all the responsibility to the one standing in the center. The gentleman stood up and reached for the hilt of his sword. He asked them if they wanted to steal from her, and his voice became irritated. One of the men answered yes to this. The gentleman raised his sword, waving it, and quickly asked them if they just wanted to shed blood or maybe just make someone tremble in fear in front of them, and impatiently waited for an answer. He looked at the reflection of the faces on his sword and, lowering his tone, told the boys not to be sad, and said that he just wanted to help them. The man whose reflection was on the sword was thinking about why this bastard gentleman was so insightful, but he did not allow himself to look at him and looked somewhere to the side on the floor. Glancing at the gentleman, he understood that he had made a huge tiger with one blow, and if he had chosen the wrong side, his fate would have been the same. The gentleman, frowning and smiling wryly, asked the group whether they had all been seriously beaten by one old woman. A friend from the group, a very plump man without looking up, said that this is how it was, and fell silent. The gentleman called and glared at everyone who stood before him. He looked at them from head to toe and studied the smallest details. He believed that they had been dealt with by someone very experienced, given their appearance and wounds. Not everyone hits like that, inflicting such blows and injuries. Without changing his gaze, he continued to look at them. He decided that it could be one of the shamans. 8 years ago, after an assassination attempt on a shaman's apprentice, he was closely watched, after which he took refuge in Wuchang and changed his name. He had to lie low for a long time, finally destroying any traces leading to him. He kept looking at these guys, who weren't so weak that an ordinary old woman could beat them up like that, and no one came to the master's mind except for the shamans. He told the boys to leave the old woman alone and forget about it. Now the woodcutters would be under the protection and responsibility of Wang Sam. The boys were indignant at this and objected. He shouted loudly and called for silence, deafening the men standing in front of him, calling them idiots and saying that because of them he would now have to deal with this old woman himself. He ordered them to shut up and get lost, without annoying him even more. The dissatisfied and dejected men hurried to leave the master's reception hall and get out of his sight. The gentleman remained sitting in the chair and thinking about the old woman. He had to find out who she was. He tried to figure out this situation, starting his sword to shine. But there were risks. After all, if she was one of the shamans, he would have to leave. He was not happy with this prospect, but there was nothing he could do about it. He wanted to quickly find out who this old woman was. And if she was not one of the shamans, then he would do everything so that she would know what it meant to touch Mayupila's subordinates. The children and their grandmother were already returning home from the market. On the way, they looked at the other stalls, the traders, and studied their goods. Having bought the necessary things and ice cream to lift their spirits after such a hard morning, they tried to distract themselves and forget everything. They smiled, ate ice cream, and enjoyed the pleasant moment. Finally leaving the market, it was possible to speed up towards home. They reached the house only when darkness fell. The first stars were about to light up. The sounds of the forest were dying down, preparing for sleep. So Young went out into the yard, trying not to distract anyone with unnecessary rustling. By this time the sky was already shining, strewn with stars. He raised his gaze to the sky and peered into the depths of the celestial expanse. He thought about the beauty he saw at that moment, and wondered why he had never noticed this before, why he had never thought to lift his head up and look at such magic. He stood there, carefully examining each star, and was grateful to his grandmother that she was able to show him another side of the world. So beautiful and fascinating. He wanted to see the movements of heaven and earth once again, and tried to concentrate all his attention on his sensations. Behind him, he heard his grandmother scream and curse. She said that he should have been asleep long ago, and besides, she saw him in the yard. The guy shuddered and realized that he was caught. Grandma lowered her tone and said that So Young did not think about himself at all, that he should sleep and rest more to be healthy and strong. She stood holding the basin in one hand and putting the other to her side. The young man assured her with a smile that he was absolutely fine and asked why she was still not sleeping. She replied that she had come to light a fire because it had become quite cold and she needed to warm up. She took the basin with both hands and changed her strict tone to a smile and a soft voice. The boy watched as the old woman sat down, placed the basin on the ground, and began to make a fire, either poking with a stick or blowing on the branches several times. He wanted her to hug him. He had already become very attached to her and already considered her a member of the family, trusting her completely. He remembered how his younger sisters were not afraid to show their love, could press their cheeks to their grandmother and hold her hand, but he was afraid to do the same. But then he decided to overcome his excitement and do what he wanted so much. The guy thought about his grandmother, and he timidly took her hand as she stood and watched the fire grow. Granny gasped in surprise and thought that he wanted something, or maybe he wanted to warm up, and waited for him to say, "But I decided to check if he was cold after all." So Young said no and hesitated again. He repeated the beginning of the phrase that he just, but did not finish it. He was completely red from embarrassment and excitement. Grandma laughed and said she understood. She didn't yell or tell him to go away. She just chuckled sweetly and squeezed his hand back. She stroked his hair and said that she had a very cute grandson. Yang felt very nice and comfortable, and it became so easy, as if all the problems had disappeared. They stood under the bright night sky, and she hugged him like her own child. closing him off from the whole world and its problems. A little later, they were sitting by the fire and warming themselves. The coals were crackling and giving off their heat to them. The young man announced a question that had arisen and asked about the moment when they were climbing the mountain. The grandmother, confused, asked what he meant. He explained that he meant what she had been able to show him, about the wind blowing and the sun's rays, and how this world works. He looked timidly at his grandmother, afraid that she would not want to talk to him. Granny raised an eyebrow and asked him to continue. She was very curious about what he would say to this. So Young tried to find the words to express his emotions and thoughts that were swirling around in his head. Grandma was still waiting for his answer, narrowing her eyes and tensing up. She scanned him with her eyes and remembered the moment when he caught the wind and the sun. She wondered if he could actually feel and see something. She wondered if he could see something more than she thought. Her grandson replied that the world looked completely different to him now, not like before. The grandmother asked how different the world looked. The guy replied that before he was as if blind. He did not notice anything around him, but now he sees a lot, and he fell silent, immersed in his thoughts. Grandmother, without lowering her eyebrows, suggested to herself with pleasant surprise that perhaps this was still Tao. She answered the boy that this is how the heavens and the earth work. They do not stand still and do not turn back. She closed her eyes and continued to say that everything that is gone comes back. The world revolves in a circle, and such is its order. So Yang, trying to understand and believe, asked again whether correct breathing could really allow one to understand the heavens and the earth. He was very interested in the new knowledge, but did not fully understand it. The old woman was surprised and stared at him. She asked how he knew this, and she thought to herself that these were the last words in Taiheo's diary, and how could a child know them? The boy replied that she had told him about it herself, and the old woman began to lament that she had become quite old and had probably simply forgotten about it. She praised him and pointed out that he was smart, surprised that he remembered everything and was trying to understand these words. She again carefully stroked his hair, saying praise for him. She looked at his face and thought what a hard life he had. She felt very sorry for him because he had to grow up too early to take care of his family. She stroked his hair, calming him down. But suddenly her hand stopped and froze on his head. She pulled her eyes out of his and waited for him to pay attention to her. The boy asked her if something had happened and became tense from such a change in her behavior. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath into her lungs and exhaled completely, as if rebooting her breathing. She rarely started yelling at him and questioning him about why he got into that fight at the market. There was no trace of tenderness left. The boy was taken aback by such a scream and reminded her that she herself had told him. She ordered him to shut up, saying that she only asked him to hold out and not to get punched. She was going to kick their asses anyway. She asked reproachfully what was wrong with him that he had done such a thing. He pulled himself together and said confidently that he wanted to protect those little children and asked if it was a bad thing to do. He knew that he had to stand up for himself now. He remembered those kids and said that no one else helped them, and he would hardly have done it. There was no one there to stand up for them except him, just like no one helped him and his sister. He thought that adults would help, but no one came to help. He felt a little sad from these painful memories. The grandmother listened to him and asked him why he just stood there while the big guy beat the kids. So Young admitted that he was very afraid and couldn't decide for a long time. Then he added that he believed in his grandmother, and that gave him the courage to meet that bastard face to face. He also admitted that if it weren't for his grandmother, he would most likely have died. He vigorously defended his position, struggling with his excitement. The grandmother stroked his head again and said that she knew about his faith in her. She smiled again, satisfied with her grandson's answer. She told him that she was very proud of him and that the spirit of a dragon lived in him. The boy looked up at her, not understanding what she was talking about and asking her to explain. She said that he could achieve a lot with his pure heart. Noting that he bravely accepts other people's pain without thinking about his own, and that he enjoys watching the world. His innocence is true and there is strength in that. After which she sent him to sleep, saying that from tomorrow she would train him so that he could reach the heavens. The stars continued to shine, and the old woman thought about the future of her grandson for a very long time. At dawn, they were already in the yard. She taught him to train his body, and to have a strong body you need to have strong legs. The boy stood on the floor in a squatting position. All his muscles were shaking, but he did not give up. The sister went out to see what they were doing in the yard so early. Grandmother continued to explain that if the legs were strong, it would be hard to knock the boy off them, and the body would get stronger along with them. She said that he should stand in this pose until sunset and went into the house calling with her Yonghua, the eldest of the sisters. She was silent and simply stared at the whole picture before her. The boy held on. Sweat appeared on his face. His legs shook, resisting the order. But he did not give in and continued to stand in this position, carefully controlling his body. The day went on. Grandma and her older sister were doing the laundry, and the younger children were having fun playing their games, running around the yard. While Yonghua was hanging out the wash laundry, the grandmother approached her grandson to watch him do his work. The boy stood motionless in the same place, surprising his sister. It was obvious that he was having a hard time. He was wet with sweat, but he was gritting his teeth and struggling with himself. Grandma praised him, saying that he was doing great because training the body and controlling energy is not easy at all, and in such training the most important thing is persistence. She was very pleased with the results of her grandson. Looking at him, she thought that he had hidden a huge talent that she had not noticed before. The sun rose over the mountains, illuminating the entire valley and driving away the shadows and cold fogs of the night. So Yang had been meditating since sunrise, when the first rays of light were just trying to penetrate the valley through the high mountains. He controlled his breathing. Breathing was essentially a process of receiving the energy of heaven and earth through inhalation and exhalation. It was necessary to inhale positive energy and exhale negative energy. Grandma helped him and explained that he should imagine how negative energy leaves his body, and he was surprised and asked again if it was possible to just think about it and the bad energy would really leave. Grandma tried to explain everything to him with a smile in as much detail as possible. She said that energy is directly connected to desires. First, you had to act with your mind and then with your body. The guy was completely immersed in the meaning of each word and repeated everything to himself, concentrating on inhaling and exhaling. The purity of energy depends on the body, and the purity of the body depends on the mind. It was not for nothing that they said that if the spirit is in order, then everything will be fine with the energy. If the energy is light, then the energy of heaven and earth will also be light. He listened attentively to each phrase, trying not to get distracted. He sat in the lotus position and thought that he had been practicing the breathing technique that his grandmother had taught him for a whole month, but it was still very difficult for him. Remembering his grandmother's words that the technique of the great void is very easy, but still it is forbidden to blab about it to everyone you meet. Therefore, he could no longer share his worries with anyone. While he was meditating, his grandmother came up to him and asked why he was breathing so slowly. He looked at her in confusion. He tried very hard in his practice, but apparently it was not enough and he made many mistakes. She explained to him the most important part of the technique, how to inhale correctly and how deeply and how to exhale correctly, when you need to stretch the inhale and when you need to sharply push everything out with an exhale. He listened very carefully and remembered. According to her, he exhaled correctly but inhaled incorrectly, and if he continued to shirk, then learning this practice would take half his life. She saw that the guy had already completed this training while she was explaining to him exactly how to do it and was very surprised. After all, even she couldn't achieve its full mastery in less than 20 years. She didn't understand how a child who had never been close to martial arts could complete it. She looked at the boy, and he waited for instructions or explanations for her thoughtful silence. The old woman thought that even if he managed to complete this practice, he would have to work even harder because now any mistake could turn him into a cripple. The guy called out to his grandmother and asked what she was thinking about. The old woman turned her gaze to him. She screamed at him again, with all her might, in another fit. She waited for the boy to answer as to whether he had not been told to breathe faster and not to sit and do nothing and distract her. The boy bowed his head and said that he tried to do everything as she told him. When he inhales, he hears the wind and the creaking of branches. When he stops, the sounds also fade away. And no matter how hard he tries, he still hears the sound of the heavens and the earth. She told him that he did not yet have a sufficient foundation, despite the fact that he had mastered the practice very well, and that he needed to strengthen his mind and body more, otherwise he would harm himself. He grimaced with resentment and justified himself by saying that he was not doing all this on purpose, but that it just happened that way. He was very annoyed that such efforts were not yet bringing the desired results. The old woman called the guy a noisy fool and gave him a strong slap in the face because he was talking all sorts of nonsense, as if he had lost his mind. So Yang, rubbing his face, wanted to explain what he meant, but the old woman cut him off and told him to shut up. Now they had to move on to the next stage of training, and he needed to listen carefully. They stood in the yard. The younger sisters surrounded them and watched as their brother practiced various techniques with his hands and feet, learning to move his body smoothly, controlling every muscle. Grandmother repeated to him that it should be a law for him that the body and mind should achieve unity. Control of the body lays the foundation for the spirit to create energy, and then after harmony is formed, it will achieve unity. The grandmother continued to teach her grandson and explained that he should be like the ebb and flow of the tide, slowly grow and quickly catch up. So Young repeated each word, immediately practicing the movements. He repeated after his grandmother that he should be the first to strike, and he punched the air with his fists. The sisters looked at their brother with wide eyes, fascinated. Words of caution and the enemy's quick approval could be heard. Days passed by, the weather changed, and it became warmer. The courtyard was transformed and blossomed from the care and atmosphere in it. So Young trained every day from early morning until late evening. Grandma was always by his side and corrected his mistakes. Sometimes she explained, and sometimes she smacked him on the back with a branch so that he would straighten it. The young man became stronger, more powerful, and moved much more quickly and confidently. He did not doubt his movements and controlled his body quite well. He repeated everything over and over again, honing his mastery of this or that movement. He had enough tenacity and strength. He managed. He trained alone at sunset, far from home, repeating everything his grandmother had taught him throughout the day. The grandmother watched her grandson from afar. She was glad of his persistence. After all, learning the technique itself was not difficult, but its complete mastery can take hundreds or even thousands of training sessions. Not everyone who dares to try reaches the end. Just knowing can't be enough. There are techniques that are simply impossible to learn without repeating them. She noted how her grandson was obsessed with the Great Void technique. It was said that if one mastered its true meaning, one could reach the level of a sword god. The old woman walked away, scolding herself for these thoughts. After all, would anyone be able to do this? She watched So Young grow up and watched the seasons change. He trained every day, never missing a class, no matter what the weather was. He honed his moves in winter and the bitter cold under snow and blizzards, and it did not affect his results. When it got warmer, spring came and the sakura filled their yard with its aroma. The guy continued his training, sometimes showing different techniques to his sisters, who squealed enthusiastically at each of his skills. Summer was also spent in training and studying books to strengthen the mind. The whole family sat under a branchy tree, which protected them from the scorching sun, and studied the pages of books brought by their grandmother. They laughed, joked, and explained unclear things to each other, or they listened to the old woman's teachings. The girls were also very interested in what their brother was doing, and they often began to attend training sessions with him. One hot day, So Young went to a mountain waterfall that was hidden in a huge lake. The trees tried to hide everything around them with their branches under a dome. The young man stood waist-deep in water and listened to the sound of falling water, looking up to the very heights. Raising his hands up and crossing his palms, blocking out the sunlight, he thought about how 5 months had passed since his grandmother began teaching him. Playing with the sun's rays, sometimes letting them pass through his fingers, sometimes blocking the road again, he realized that he did not feel any changes in himself. He blamed himself and believed that he simply did not have the necessary talents to perform well. He looked at his reflection in the water and tried to find answers. He tried to feel the temperature of the water with his hands and to taste it. I listened to the noise from the breakwater, the murmur of the already fallen water, the singing of birds and the rustling of branches. He tried to feel the sunlight falling on him through the branches of the trees and the water flowing around his body. He thought about water. It never stopped. It was always in motion. He looked at the light waves of moving water and the reflection of the sun's rays from the surface. How suddenly something started to happen and he lost control of his body. It was as if the water started to rise above its level, trying to swallow him up. He plunged headfirst into the water, only struggling with his arms in an attempt to emerge. Coming out above the surface, he coughed and tried to restore his breathing. Having reached the shore, he sat and tried to understand the feeling he felt at that moment. It was a kind of tremor in his stomach. He had never felt anything like that before and was surprised. He heard his grandmother's voice behind him. She asked him if he was tired of trying here, and if he had lost his mind completely. He greeted her and waited for her to come closer. She scolded him slightly, saying that all his brothers and sisters were studying hard, and Yusong was already tired of playing alone, and he was sitting here and doing something incomprehensible. He expressed his regret but remained sitting in the same place. She asked again why he almost drowned, because it was very important and concerned practices. The guy looked down and didn't know what to say. After all, he really didn't know what happened. Grandma told him that she didn't quite understand, but she was glad that it happened in the water. And now the power inside his body will be like a stream of water. Nothing can stop it later, and if he understands this, then no enemy will be able to defeat him. He expressed his consent and submission to his grandmother and sat quietly without objecting. Here the old woman turned around and began to listen. She noticed that someone's gaze was on her and concentrated on the sensation. She began to look around carefully. They peered through the thickets of plants, trying to figure out from what place they were being watched. And it seemed she understood where she got this feeling from. The man, realizing that he had been noticed, hid behind a tree. He pressed himself as close to the ground in the tree trunk as possible, hiding from the old woman's eyes. Her gaze was directed straight at him. He became worried that she could really see him from such a distance and in such a dense forest. He didn't believe his own assumptions. After all, he had been following them for several months, and there had been no problems before. He stood up, drawing his sword, mentally wishing the old woman to enjoy her last days, and he promised to send her grandson after her so that they would not be bored. So Young approached a small hut, the roof of which was leaky in places. It was obvious that poor people lived there, but the yard and the house were quite well kept. The guy held a small bag tightly in his hands. He doubted if they remembered him here, because they had seen each other for a long time. He rehearsed a speech to give this gift to them or thought about just putting it under the door and leaving. Children's voices were heard from the hut, asking if their mother had come. So Young stood at the very entrance and did not dare to enter. The kids were arguing with each other about whether the kidnappers had come, and they were being loud and giving away. So Young said he could hear them. He reassured the children that he was not going to kidnap them, and he reminded them that they had seen each other at the market a few months ago. One of the children came out to look at his guest. Seeing the guy, he gasped in surprise. He bowed and thanked So Young for protecting him. Introducing himself as Young Woon, he informed them that they were in his debt. The boy was too scared to do so. He called Young Sun to come out and greet their guest. The girl did not come out, and he reminded her that their father taught them not to be ashamed of poverty, but never to forget about manners. The girl came out anyway, smiling modestly. So Young said that it was not a problem and smiled back at the children. The girl bowed in greeting and gratitude before the young man, under the supervision of her older brother. The boy hugged his sister and apologized, saying that she was still a child and needed to be taught a lot. So Young burst out laughing, asking who he was. So Young introduced himself to the children and said that he wanted to give them something, handing them his bag. The boy asked if he had left the same one a couple of months ago. Hearing such a serious tone from such a small boy, So Young could hardly hold back his laughter. He admitted that it was him and asked for more, but Young Woon said that he couldn't accept it, continuing to look at him seriously. He said that even if they were poor, they should have pride. Mama conveys her gratitude for the favor shown, but they do not need pity, and they will return everything given. Blushing deeply, he admitted that he had eaten a little from there but would soon return it all. So Young reminded the boy of his words about being in his debt. The boy agreed that this was true. So Young asked them to consider him their brother then. He said that he has many younger sisters and brothers, and he said that his grandmother asked him to replace their parents. The girl, unable to bear it, asked her brother to eat what they had brought, reaching for the bag. Young Woon said that he couldn't make such a decision on his own anyway and needed to consult with his mother. Young Sun asked about her location. The boy recalled what had happened, how a man at the market had smashed their goods into pieces with his feet and hands, and their mother, in horror, tried to crawl away so that it wouldn't hit her too. A group of men standing nearby were talking about how the boys were causing trouble again. It had been quiet for several days. The crusher stood and spoke discontentedly about how everyone at the market had grown bolder before they showed up here, and he threatened to teach everyone to be afraid again. The gentleman who approached him began to interrogate him about the old woman he was talking about. He replied that she was not there. The gentleman ordered him to go straight to her and asked if he knew where she lived, mockingly reminding him that since she had screwed him so much during the unsuccessful robbery, he knew. The big guy stood there burning with irritation and silently calling his master names for such humiliation. The gentleman was unhappy that he had to hang around with such idiots, even after making a name for himself in Murim. But he reassured himself that being with Wu Chang was the best choice. The gentleman said loudly that everyone who violates his orders must be punished, and the grandmother too. He ordered that they immediately go in search of the old woman and bring her to him. A boy flew out from behind him, addressing his mother. He ran up to the woman lying on the ground and tried to make sure she was okay. The boy's mother tried to calm him down so he wouldn't worry. The man who had destroyed the goods of these people looked submissively at his master. Putting his sword back into its sheath, the big guy said that it was time for him to go look for the old lady, and it was a pity that they were interrupted mid-sentence. He looked at the mother and son, who were cowering in fear and anticipation. The mother was trying to protect her child. They swung their sword, and he threatened to finish them off with just one blow. The woman screamed, begging him not to do it. He didn't have time to strike. Someone knocked the sword out of his hand as it flew. The weapon flew far away, fortunately without hitting anyone. All the people jumped back as far as possible. The master and the woodcutter's partner watched what was happening. The woodcutter roared, asking what kind of bitch dared to do such a thing. Rubbing his hand, he turned around. So Young stood firmly in his way and ordered him to stop. The brute couldn't believe his eyes and was very surprised by the appearance of this guy. He roared even louder in anger, remembering perfectly well who was standing in front of him. Pointing his finger at So Young, he told the gentleman that this boy was the grandson of the grandmother they were looking for. The young man stood silently, trying to understand what they meant. The gentleman's face twisted in anger, and his blazing eyes burned right through So Yang. So Young assessed the strength of this gentleman. He was too strong, and the guy would hardly be able to handle him. He did so that the grandmother would be nearby now. He looked at young Woon and his mother, who needed protection, and knew that he would have to take matters into his own hands. He turned to young Woon and asked if he could fulfill his request. The brute was already flying towards him and mockingly said that the request was probably about being sent to the next world with him. The young man concentrated his attention on all the details. He scanned the attacking man with his gaze. He watched how he moved and how fast he ran towards him. And in an instant he ran at him, pushing him back. Dust swirled around him and the screech of his shoes on the ground howled warnings. The woodcutter did not expect to receive a blow from the pores. The blow took his breath away. So Young didn't back down and continued to press on the big guy, blocking his movements. He was worried that his strength was not enough to fight this man. While the woodcutter was trying to catch his breath, So Young asked the boy to find the house behind the hills and tell his grandmother what was happening there. The gentleman laughed loudly and said that he would be very glad if they themselves brought the old woman here to him, and he would not have to do it himself. So Young answered the gentleman that he would not go anywhere, looking at him belligerently. The gentleman laughed and asked who could stop him. Surely someone like the boy. So Young said that he would be the one to stop. He showed no fear and stood ready for another fight. The boy stood boldly before the gentleman, while the rest of the people from the market simply stood and watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The master ordered the rascal to be killed and his tongue to be cut out without even blinking. The master's men rushed from their place and ran towards So Yang, sour cream all in their path. So Yang, ready for a fight and clenching his fists, waited for the attackers to approach. He showed me his fear and looked very brave. The master ordered to take him while So Yang repelled the blows of his men one after another. He knocked down grown and strong men as if he was on par with them. Those standing behind him gasped at what they saw and hesitated. The chief woodcutter's friend stood and squealed like a pig in fear of the butcher. So Young came close to him and ordered him to kneel down and apologize to this lady. The gentleman, not hiding his irritation, hissed that this little rascal was too noisy, threatening him. More people flew at the boy, but he stood and was ready to fight them, even though he doubted his strength against them. Meanwhile, in the garden, Grandma and her older sister, Yonghua, were working on the cabbage beds. They were chatting about their own things and had no idea what was happening in the city. Grandma was distracted by some tramping and rustling from the forest. She raised her head and began to listen. Young Woon ran along the path as fast as he could, trying to find the old woman and quickly tell her about what was happening in the city. The old woman already knew who was running and was worried about what made the child run so fast. She got up from the beds and informed the girl that it was time for her to go. The girl looked questioningly at the old woman. She became alarmed and asked if something was wrong, stopping doing her work. Grandma told her that someone was approaching and he might get hurt if he continued running so fast. She said that she would go and meet him and that the girl should stay where she was, and then the old woman seemed to disappear into thin air. The girl didn't have time to understand where her grandmother had disappeared to, and you looked around in surprise, trying to find her with your eyes. The grandmother stood in the middle of a forest path and held the little boy, trying to help him. He hung on her arm, gasping for breath. She pounded his back and pressed on the right places, trying to restore his breathing and let him catch his breath. When the boy was able to catch his breath a little, she asked where he was going and why he was in such a hurry. He began to cry and begged to save his mother. The old woman began to ask in bewilderment what had happened to his mother. The boy rattled off that Jinso Yang had sent him to tell him about the situation. He was crying and very scared. The grandmother raised an eyebrow and asked again, not believing what she had heard. She stood and looked at the boy, waiting for answers. The boy tried to retell everything he saw and knew in a confused manner. The old woman listened to him attentively and thought about her own. She was worried that her grandson had been studying martial arts for less than a year, and how he would cope with everything alone. The grandmother pointed her finger at the boy and into the house and ordered him to go there and wait. The boy, in tears, tried to argue because his mother was in a completely different place. Grandma tried to calm him down and said that she would save his mother and that he should not worry and just go to that house. The fight continued in the market. Many of the men who had attacked So Young stood and watched his agility and strength and courage. The boy behaved very decently and bravely. He expressed readiness for any next fight with any of them. Several people near the boy were already lying unconscious on the ground. The rest of the men stood and waited for the right moment. One of them was absolutely itching to deal with the boy and chop him into pieces, as he was really getting on his nerves. He drew his sword and began to approach the boy, preparing to attack. The young man waited. The man, waving his swords, laughed at the young man and advised him to fall to the ground and beg for his life, and perhaps the old man would spare him. Undeterred, So Young rushed towards the attacker and punched him in the face with a single jerk, sending blood flying everywhere. Having dealt with yet another of the master's men, So Young called him the fifth. He fell to the ground unconscious. Before the boy could come to his senses, another man attacked him, swinging his sword high above him and shouting various insults at him. Just before the sword strike, So Yang deftly jumped back, doing a somersault to the side. This further irritated the man, who was eager to finish off the boy. In an instant, the young man jumped back and jumped on the blade of the sword, recently its owner, to swing again. He acted confidently and very quickly. Another second, and the guy's technique once again struck another gentleman. It seemed as if it cost him nothing and did not take away any strength at all. The mercenary fell, and the sword rolled away from his hands. The young man landed on the ground immediately in a fighting position, waiting for the next attack. At that moment, a wild, burning pain pierced the young man. His back was on fire and his mind was clouded. The man cut a deep wound on his back with a sword. The people watching this from the side blindfolded themselves for a while, turned away, closing their eyes. Even the master's men were shocked by what had happened. Blood was gushing in all directions, paralyzing the guy with its pain, but he still stood firmly on his feet. He didn't immediately understand what had happened. He only thought about how much it hurt, but he didn't give up and kept all his strength to himself. He didn't let himself get away. He denied that this was the end, and he was sure that he could still do it. He could defeat the master and protect all people. The rest of the people standing waiting for this moment flew away. The man in front shouted that this was just a rascal, and he needed to be finished off as soon as possible. Approaching the boy, he thought that this was his last moment, not even hoping for resistance from him, but suddenly he flew back from a kick to the chest. A sixth warrior was added to the defeated ones already lying on the ground. The ferocity in Yang's eyes did not disappear, and he waited with a roar for the next one. The gentleman watched and thought that the guy's movements were becoming more and more advanced. He should have known only 5 techniques, but he had already mastered the 6th. He concluded that the boy was well trained, based on the fact that such a young man had defeated 7 adults. He had clearly been trained by a great master, since he could grow so much in 6 months. But he decided that it didn't matter anymore, since the guy was exhausted and had lost a lot of blood. The young man's body howled in pain again. He was truly exhausted. His strength had already begun to leave him. His attentiveness had become worse, since he had allowed himself to be injured twice already. He was wounded with a dagger in the right side. The young man sat down and grabbed his wound. Holding on and not letting the blood flow out of him so quickly, he resisted and forced himself to stand up. People stood in their places with their mouths open. Some were very worried about him, and some were just waiting to see how it would all end. A shadow covered So Young, who was crouched on his feet. The pain that pierced his body made him unable to even raise his head and look at the person who had approached him. A crowd surrounded him. They cheered loudly that the young man had finally fallen into their hands. They told him not to even hope for a peaceful death after all the trouble he had caused. So Young was seething with anger, gritting his teeth as he tried to find the strength to fight another battle. The men stood next to him, grinning contentedly. The group of men were distracted by someone's words. The voice called them scum, asking how shameless they had to be to attack a boy in a crowd. They turned their heads towards the outgoing sound. There was a guy standing in front of them with a rock in his hands and shouting that he couldn't stand up for them because he was afraid. He said that he was still afraid, but he couldn't just stand and watch anymore. He stood in the crowd and urged them to attack. He shouted that this guy had more courage than any of the people standing here, and he would stop the scum even if he died. One of the gentleman's men, calmly flexing his fists, said that if they wanted to die so much, then he would fulfill their wish without any problems. An old woman screamed next to this young man. She called for him to kill her first, since she only had a couple of days left anyway. The gentleman's man calmly asked who else wanted to die. People started screaming. They took turns shouting for him to kill them first, interrupting each other and arguing. So Young, of course, could raise his eyes. He looked at these screaming people with delight and was happy for their support. The master's voice was heard. His men turned towards him. He shouted that he would kill them all at once if they did not shut up. He flew with all his might, like a scavenger looking down on his prey. He rushed towards So Yang, threatening that he could not allow him to live another second, drawing his swords along the way. From his jump, he rushed at the guy and caught him with the edge of his sword, wounding him again. The young man trying to dodge thought how strong the gentleman was. He was overcome with excitement. Blood was oozing from the figures of the abrasions and his strength seemed ready to leave him. Sometimes he misses. Sometimes he dodges the blows of the gentleman. The boy began to understand that he would not be able to cope with him. He would hardly be able to win this fight. The gentleman, hovering over the boy, noted that his footwork was incredible. He was surprised that the boy had only been practicing martial arts for less than a year. He had to kill him quickly before he became even stronger, and the gentleman swung his sword, preparing to deal the last blow in the young man's life. The sword was a few centimeters from the boy's face, about to split his head open. So Young knew he had no chance. The grandmother was already very close and saw what was happening to her grandson and the people who were simply crowding around. Seeing the sword hanging over her grandson, she opened her mouth and her eyes widened as she continued to run towards him. But she knew she was too far away to save him. She screamed loudly and ordered this bastard to stop. All Ya heard was a familiar voice, and his gaze turned towards the sound. Their eyes met. Babushka was very worried, and the boy smiled with relief, not realizing that he could die the next second. The sword rushed down. It seemed that the gentleman had achieved what he wanted and finished off the boy. Everything happened in a split second. The young man followed the practices, remembering his grandmother's words. In his head, words about the power of energy, about the flow of the river sounded. There was no such force capable of stopping the flow of the river. If you know how water flows, you can defeat opponents who are stronger than you. So Yang grabbed the blade of the master's sword. For a second, he was able to parry the blow and push the gentleman a little further away from himself. The gentleman did not expect that the boy could still resist. Could this really be catabolism, he wondered? He watched the young man fight to the last, how he used techniques and how he regained his strength. And he could not understand how he could so quickly understand the secrets of ascension. The gentleman attacked the young man again and again. He could not delay any longer. He wanted to finish the boy off quickly. He grabbed his hand, but So Yang showed surprising resistance to the master's strength. He was furious about how the boy got so much strength. The guy seemed to be easily twisting his arms. Without being distracted by anything unnecessary, the young man hit the gentleman in the face with incredible force. The blow was so strong that the gentleman flew back and most likely lost consciousness. The boy on foot himself does not understand what just happened to him. It would seem that he did not even have time to touch the man's face, but he was thrown back several meters. Granny stood in shock from what she saw, period. She also did not understand where he got so much strength from, because he trained for less than a year and could not get so strong. Apparently, she devalued his talent. Something unknown happened to him. He stood firmly on his feet, wounded and exhausted. But despite this, he still had a lot of strength. The gentleman, who had not lost consciousness, lay and thought. If this woman had taught the boy, he would not even dare touch her if he wanted to get out alive. He jumped up and grabbed the woman, Young Woon's mother. He brought the dagger to her throat and she screamed loudly. So Young gasped and stood dumbfounded, trying to figure out what to do next. The gentleman hissed, threatening the boy not to move from his place. He continued to hold the woman, holding the dagger to her. Her little daughter was reaching out to her and hugging her. She was just a baby. She was crying loudly and was terribly scared. The gentleman put forward conditions. He wanted the old lady to leave this place and then he would release the woman he was holding hostage. The woman tried to calm the little girl down by telling her that she was okay. Even though her life was in danger, she was still worried about her child. The gentleman spared no one. No one responded to his words, and he wounded the woman. So he ran up and started screaming at him to let go of her mother. She punched him with her little fists as far as she could reach. He yelled at her to get away from him and kicked her hard. So Young jumped up and ran toward the little girl who rolled on the ground and clearly hit herself hard. Suddenly the gentleman howled in pain. A large stone hit him. The sword fell into his hand. It was very painful. He had to loosen his grip. A grandmother was making her way through the crowd. Her fists were tightly clenched. Looking at her expression, I wanted to run away right away. The gentleman rubbed and kneaded his bruised hand, completely releasing the girl from his paws. The girl hurried away, wiping her injured cheek, the wounded and bloody. So Young ran up to the girl, calling her auntie and hugging her, worried about her condition. He looked at the wounds on her face that were bleeding. The woman was silent and did not moan slightly from pain. The young man helped her sit down on the ground, and she leaned on one hand, supporting herself. Letting go of the girl and standing up, Yang looked towards the master. He was ready to rush into battle again. Gathering all his strength, he walked towards him. His eyes sparkled with anger. He was ready to tear apart anyone who would stand in his way. The gentleman saw the young man approaching and screamed at him not to come near him. He waved his hands and head in fear and denial. A storm of blows rained down on him, which the young man dealt one after another, not giving him time to catch his breath. The gentleman screamed and asked why this particular guy was doing this to him. The young man's fists hit him in completely different places, taking away the last drop of his strength. A dagger flashed in So Yang's bloody hand. Gripping the blade tighter in his hand, the young man jumped on the gentleman, shouting that he would finish him off. The gentleman could barely stand on his feet under the boy's strength. The boy was holding a dagger in his hands, about to pierce his master with it. He clutched the knife tightly in his hand. He was afraid of it, but he had no other choice. Suddenly something stopped his hand. He turned around to see who or what it was. Grandma stood next to him and held his hand with the dagger. She said that they would finish with this for now. The young man's eyes began to water, period. He was very happy to see his grandmother. After all, it meant that he had coped and was no longer in danger. The dagger fell from his hands and landed near the gentleman lying on the ground. He was spread out in all directions, barely reacting to what was happening. He sat on the ground, bending low. Grandmother came up behind him. Putting her hand on his back, she asked if he knew why he had to fight. She kept asking him questions. She asked what he needed to learn martial arts and what made him honest. What did it take to become stronger? He remained silent. Finally, he said that now he knows what to do for this. Grandma asked him if he still wanted to learn martial arts, or maybe he should stop. She already knew the answer. Oppa stood up. He said confidently and clearly that yes, he wanted to study them further. There was determination in his eyes, and it was definitely true. Then the grandmother said that then the old lady, meaning herself, would help him improve. She smiled, satisfied with the answer. People in the market began to disperse. The woman who had fallen at the hands of the guy was still lying unconscious. She and her grandmother, not noticing anyone around them, sat opposite each other. They were being watched. A man from behind one of the tents told another that he saw an old woman. No one paid any attention to them. He said he didn't know how much martial arts this guy had learned, but he showed more strength than he should have at his age. He must have been taught by an old lady. Looking again at the market square and the old woman with her grandson, I confirmed that it was definitely her. The second one, covered by a cloak, said that he understood everything, and now he is also sure of it. The first pointed to the last thrown stone that flew out of nowhere. He asked if she had said that she had trained the Lord, and pointed out that this martial art knows no conscience. He hastened to assure that they needed to meet her immediately, but the second one in the cloak doubted it. He asked why. Did he mean to say that they should wait a little longer? The other agreed. He agreed, since she had plum disease, and they should approach her more slowly, but he wondered how long they would have to wait. The man in the raincoat suggested that it could be 5 or 6 years. The second one asked again, dumbfounded. He told him that even the brushwood would receive a report that his mother had not been found, at least not in the next 5 or 6 years. The first one asked again what he meant, raising his eyebrows in disagreement with his words. The man in the cloak bared his teeth and hissed that this meant he needed to die. His eyes flashed and his teeth clenched. The second one, realizing what was happening, asked whose pawn he was. He hadn't noticed the trick for too long, and now he would get paid for it. The man in the cloak suggested listening to what the man behind him would say. Before he could turn around, an arrow pierced his chest. He howled, holding onto the base of the arrow. His blood stained everything around, part of the tent, the ground, and the fence they were standing under, giving away what had happened here. The man in the cloak stood and looked at the lifeless body of the fallen man. He smiled, addressing him to the body. He said that even though he was dead and could not hear the answer, He should have known that the man behind him was a Hwama of Magog in blood. The man bowed badly before the master and said that he did not know that the junk would arrive personally and so quickly. Mr. Hwama looked at the old woman and her grandson standing in the square or whoever finally found her. The man in the cloak shared his opinion that she looked like an ordinary old woman. The gentleman was indignant. He said that he did not think that he was capable of feeling the strength of this old lady at his level of martial arts, and that even he would not be able to cope with her. The gentleman thanked Sheoli Bim for his good work and said that he would reward him for his efforts later. Sheoli Bim said he had a question. He asked what was the reason for waiting 5 or 6 years to catch Grandma. The gentleman replied that it was to avoid excitement. The man in the raincoat looked at him questioningly. The gentleman nervously asked again, had he forgotten what his art would be from Jinsawola. I said that if this old woman reaches this status during the battle, victory will become impossible. The man in the cloak looked at my master with confusion. The gentleman replied that the bloody demon promised that in 5 or 6 years, even 10 denims would not be able to defeat him. Then even the old lady would be helpless against him. The master ordered to hide in the shadows and tie the Lord's hands and feet, control all information. He must prevent that old lady from meeting the Murim. The gentleman continued and said that if you think about it, a man from the Murims leads a gang of thugs in Chang and asked to get rid of him. Sheoli Bim bowed and promised to carry out all orders. The gentleman stayed and watched the old woman who was standing in the market square with her grandson and other people. And I watched how the old woman showed concern for little orphans. She treated them with sweets, but I have no idea what awaits her. The gentleman silently wished for her to live peacefully with the orphans, peacefully while she could. The seasons changed one after another, and the life of the old woman and her orphans went on as usual. Summer gave up its place to autumn, and allowed the leaves to be painted yellow and mercilessly thrown off the branches. Autumn tried to overcome winter and its severe cold, and allowed itself to be covered with its snow-white blanket. So Young continued to train daily. Neither the heat nor the bitter cold and snow were an obstacle for him. In the port, on one of the ships, work proceeded at its own pace. Men were tightening the sails, repairing important parts of the deck. From one of the ships, a group of men were heard talking. One of the men asked if that meant he was the one causing all this trouble. Another voice laughed and said that he was just a kid, but it seemed like he was someone to emulate, and everyone joined in the laughter. The woodcutter said he didn't want to do it, but he was there to get rid of the kid who was trying to earn a coin. He didn't really like it. On another ship, a young voice nervously explained to a merchant something he still could not understand. He repeated it again, sitting on the packed cargo, not noticing the crowd of people walking around, who in turn also did not pay any attention to the guy. One of the men standing nearby responded and said that he was very good at calculations and quick-witted and looked like an experienced person in terms of planning. Many people around him paid attention to him and thought about what he said. One of the men objected to the other, asking if he was serious about trading with him. The man asked him not to move. The young man guessed that the man was the owner of the top of the Xin-Yang heavens. He asked if he had any questions for him. He could tell any information for 10 copper coins. The man said he needed information about Wu Chang. He asked the boy's name. The boy repeated that he was waiting for 10 copper coins. The man swung and slapped the young man, saying that this was a very disrespectful attitude towards an adult. Here another young man intervened. He apologized on his own behalf and said that this guy was his brother Jin Seng Jo, and he called himself Jin So Young. A crowd of people gathered around the boys. Many even turned their heads out of curiosity as they passed by. The man repeated Jin So Young's name, wondering what to do with him and his brother next. Jin So Young stood with his arms crossed over his chest in a pleading gesture, asking for forgiveness for his brother's rudeness. The young man added that he also apologized to the person standing behind the man. The man laughed, turning around to look at the person who was behind him. A tall, middle-aged man stood under the tents and watched them. A sword was visible behind his back. The man, seeing that he was noticed, did not want to believe it, because he thought that he had completely hidden his presence. He looked at Jin and Yang, catching his gaze on him. He tried to understand and assumed that perhaps the boy's senses were incredibly acute, that he was able to notice him. The man who accepted the apology asked them not to worry about the incident. He did not wish them any harm. He simply saw a talented guy and wanted to advise him to study the path of trade. Jin Seng-jo said with a grin that he was already well trained in this, crossing his arms over his chest importantly. His older brother shouted at him to humble his pride and asked him to watch his language and tone. Jin So-young apologized again for his younger brother's rudeness to everyone present. He said that his younger brother was quite stubborn, so he should decide his own path. But he hoped that they would forgive him. The man smiled and said that it was not very good, but if they suddenly changed their minds, then let them come to him. Sangjo laughed, said that he would not change his mind, but thanked him for the offer. The man who had been watching them from afar approached So Yang and asked if he had understood his name correctly. The boy said that he had understood everything correctly. The man chuckled and fell silent, thinking about something without taking his eyes off the young man. Without saying anything to him, he hurried after the departing merchants. Sangjo, watching a group of traders leave, said that the main one of them was too soft, grimacing with displeasure. So Young slapped his brother on the back of the head, reminding him that he had asked him to watch his words. The boy doubled over in surprise. The merchants walked Dasha about their business and talked. One of them said that the boy had a very rare talent, and he was very sorry that he did not agree to his offer. The man with the sword on his back said that he was more interested in the boy's older brother. The merchant chuckled questioningly and turned to him. The man explained that despite the fact that he hid his presence, the boy easily discovered him, and they would be in the black if they took him and raised him. The merchant said in surprise that this was not like him, period. Couldn't one conclude that the boy was involved in martial arts? The man with the sword prepared an answer. The merchant laughed and said that he thought it was all funny, period. He liked both brothers, and he would like to know information about them. The man, without losing sight of the boys, said that he would find her. A ship was approaching the pier. Any minute now it was supposed to reach the shore and moor. On the deck, one could see a young man who was happily waving his hands towards the shore, greeting the guys waiting for him. Sangjo said that this guy had grown a lot, and he had already forgotten when they had last seen each other. Sangjo remembered, and it seemed to him that it had been about a year ago. Shengzhou grabbed his head in realization. If Young Wung had passed the test, he would have been the only one who had failed. So Young laughed and said that he only had himself to blame. The ship landed at the shore. The sailors didn't have time to lower the foot. Yang Wun quickly ran to meet him, calling out to his brothers. He immediately started asking how they were doing, noticing that Seong Zhou had also arrived. Seo Young replied that things were going well and asked if he had passed the test. Yang Wun bragged that he passed, noting that it was very easy, and asked who could fail him. Sangjo replied irritably that someone could. Young Wun politely apologized and laughed. Sangjo suggested going home and resting since the boy had already returned, notifying him that they would then see who was the better fighter. He had been training hard all this time and advised the boy to be careful. So Young turned him around and told him that he shouldn't start a fight just to show off his strength, period, despite his hard training. Yang Wun asked the boys if his younger sister took good care of her mother. The boys decided to hurry up to find out everything and have a rest. So Young walked ahead calmly and confidently. The guys behind were fooling around with each other the whole way, playfully wrestling. On the way, Yang Van asked So Yang what happened in Wuchang. The guy? He looked at the young man, demanding an explanation. The young man explained that there was talk of a famous bandit called Tai Hang Mado. He was a ruthless man, and many people from the righteous factions came to Wuchang to kill him. So Young replied that he didn't know about it, but he had been feeling very restless lately, and that was probably the reason. Sangjo said that it was not surprising, and he had seen a lot of people with swords lately. So Young looked at his brother in surprise. He replied that he couldn't know about it because people at the port don't talk about it. Many people had visited Wuchang in the past few days, and the cavalry called Hodukos had too. The young man thought that this was why he had been feeling uncomfortable in the past few days. So Young was surprised that Shengzhou felt the same way, to which his brother also asked in surprise. Young Wung watched them silently. So Young shared that she felt terrible anxiety for several days. Grandma feels the same. No one knows if something happened. Suddenly something started to fall from the sky and the guys stopped. It was not entirely clear whether it was rain with hail or stones falling from the sky. The guys stood and asked each other what was going on around them, continuing to stand in place. She grabbed the bag tighter and hurried. Grandmother doubted Yang Wun's arrival calmly and hurried herself to meet him faster. And she had to stop abruptly because she felt something's presence. In front of her stood a man in a cape with a ball in a sheath. He did not look friendly and seemed to have been waiting for her here for a long time. Grandma stopped and thought, what are the bandits doing here? And these are several times more terrible than those she saw several years ago. Looking at the man with a huge long beard almost to his waist, she understood that she had to deal with them, or they would cause trouble for her grandchildren. Grandma roared at the bandit, asking why he had blocked the road. Without choosing her words, she ordered him to leave before she reported it to the government office. Without moving, in a slightly pitiful voice, he will answer how disappointed he is to see her like this. Everyone knew about her plum disease, but the blood demon still considered her a threat, but apparently in vain. Grandma roared even louder, calling it all nonsense. She demanded to know what he meant. She yelled at him to shut up and get away. The man, without showing any concern, offered to introduce himself to her again, since she didn't remember him. He said that he did not take her life without saying a word, only because of respect for her past merits, and she does not dare not show respect to him. Grandma raised her eyebrows and didn't understand who he was and what he wanted from her, but she was very angry. Behind him, faces suddenly began to appear as if in a fog. Every second they became clearer and more real. In an instant, they did not turn into absolutely real people who were already rushing towards her, drawing their swords. The suddenness did not make the grandmother lose her head. She stood firm and confidently, waiting for the attackers to approach. There was a short moment left before the approaching warriors cut the grandmother down with their swords, but she stood motionless, only raising one hand in front of her. In a second, with one snap of her fingers, she caused the blade of the sword to crumble from this seemingly light touch. The bandits stopped when they saw what he could do, their eyes wide open and their mouths hanging open at what they saw. It left them in complete shock. Without much effort, just with the light movements of her hands, which she was very good at, she could put down anyone who was there. People flew away from her a great distance, never reaching their target. She stood completely unharmed, repelling all the blows of the attack. She stood in the center and chaos reigned around her. Dust rose head over heels, and one could only see the flickering bodies of the people she had defeated. A tree branch appeared in her hands and she raised it high on her head, swinging it and placing it in front of him like a sword in one motion. The branch seemed to catch fire from the force of energy holding it. The old woman instantly ceased to be one. She stood there full of militancy. No one expected that she was still so strong and full of this energy. It was as if a hurricane had broken out here. The wounded people were trying to cope with their wounds. Others were trying to shield themselves from the storm raging around them and take cover from the flying rocks. Here the bandit with the long beard hissed that she had not needed a weapon before. In the past, she had not used such tricks. Well, it was as if he had expected this. His subordinates rushed at the old woman altogether, hoping to defeat her in this way. But it didn't work, and all of them flew away from the energy wave in different directions, and it only took a few moves to destroy the huge squad. Flying in different directions, they did not understand how she could do such a thing with just one tree branch. In an instant, it seemed as if she had created many clones of herself. She was everywhere. She had become a huge squad to protect herself. The screams continued around her for no one to stop attacking her. The bandits continued to attack her, but my attempts were futile. They could not harm her, flying away in different directions from her techniques. The commander roared for them to maintain formation, but if it could help them. Time after time, the attackers were thrown back as if by a blast wave. They had to start all over again, losing their comrades one by one. It seemed impossible to stop this storm. The old woman had perfect control over her energy. It was as if she was floating above the ground. She easily defeated her offenders, striking them down without a drop of regret or pity. She defended her grandchildren, which gave her so much strength. Or one of them managed to slightly touch her with the blade of his sword at that moment. A strand of her gray hair fell from her head. But that's all this bandit managed to do. With a quick movement of the branch in her hand, she cut off the arm almost from the shoulder. Her hair fell apart. She stood in the center. I go down my weapon around her, was a dozen wounded and also already unconscious people of the master, and only a few survivors stood for him. She smiled sarcastically and asked not to be afraid of her. The storm around her began to subside. They may have been afraid, but they had orders. They rushed from their place and ran towards the old woman. She had to swing her branch again instead of a sword, and I didn't have to spend a huge amount of my strength. With one swing and one smile, they too were defeated. Their swords fell from their hands and their masters flew to the rest of their long-lying comrades. They could not resist, and they could not dodge such a blow. Even their cries of surprise quickly died down. The old woman stood there full of anger and shouted at them that she would not take their lives because they all had them. Well, if they dared to attack her again, they would lose their arms and legs. The master laughed and asked if it would not be better to cut off their heads, and swinging his sword, he cut off his subject's head. His body fell, and his head rolled like a wheel on an unknown trajectory. There was no mercy in the eyes of the gentleman, and he proved it with his actions. One of the bandits screamed in bewilderment, looking at his comrade's head. The gentleman, ignoring the cries of his subjects, swung his sword, wagging the blade of his scabbard a couple of times, and rushed forward. It didn't take him long to decapitate all of his subjects. Grandma stood there in bewilderment and shouted at him what he was doing. Weren't these his people? Having finished his business, he hissed his answer that he didn't care, period. They were just cannon fodder, and they were destined to die. It didn't matter who killed them, she or he. Standing over the bodies of his men, he added that he hoped that the death of them all would awaken the true nature of the woman. He swung again and threw the sword like a spear towards the old woman. Well, she called him a scumbag beyond salvation, preparing to repel another attack. The sword seemed to forget its purpose and flew over her head. She told him threateningly that she had to punish him. The storm rose again, trying to knock the gentleman off his feet. He tried with all his might to resist the onslaught of its energy, trying to cover his face from dust and small stones. Crouching on the ground, cut and wounded, he laughed and hissed that even though she was struck by illness, her skills had not gone anywhere. But they were still not the same as they were 50 years ago. She looked at him angrily and asked again what 50 years he was talking about. He pointed at her with his dagger, and he confirmed that exactly 50 years had passed. An energy sphere began to form at the end of his dagger, which most likely only the two of them could see. The old woman, not expecting this, tensed up. She could guess what would happen next. The gentleman rushed at her with all the power he had, breaking through stones and dust. The old woman prepared to repel the attack and gathered her strength, directing it into the necessary technique. The gentleman continued to rush towards her without a drop of fear or doubt. He was sure that now everything would end. She couldn't cope with such pressure and was thrown to the ground. She gasped. The medallion around her neck broke and flew off, falling to the ground. While it was falling to the ground, the old woman wondered where she got this decoration from and how long she had been wearing it. She remembered So Young standing there holding the medallion in his hands. He said that she didn't have many ornaments. But she lay there and remembered that she got this decoration from her grandson. She was very grateful to him for it. The medallion fell to the ground. It was broken into many pieces. The old lady crawled up to him and screamed convulsively, "I don't believe she could break. I'm trying to put all his parts back together." The Lord stood mad with joy. He praised the Heavenly Mother Marima, who bowed before him. Memories floated before the old woman's eyes, period. In front of her stood little children who asked if she would abandon them like her parents. She saw their images but could not remember who they were and how she could know them. Thoughts were spinning in her head, eclipsing each other. She was thinking about these children and trying to remember. She sat down on the ground holding the medallion in her hands. The storm began to form around her again. Her hair fluttered in the wind and her face expressed confusion. The Lord of the Flight shouted farewell to her, swinging his sword for the last time. He was ready to attack and finish her off in one fell swoop. This was the perfect chance to do it. But suddenly the woman's eyes turned into two huge bright lights. She hissed something about her children and was ready to tear the man into small pieces. His eyes lit up with a bright clot of light. He recoiled, squinting and opening his mouth in surprise. He couldn't immediately see what was the source of such a glow. The light faded. He looked at the old woman with suspicion and even more irritation. He thought that everything would be over with her any minute. The old woman stood before him, her hair fluttering and her eyes shining like two fires. She looked straight ahead, not noticing the man yet. She smiled broadly and very maliciously without looking away. She remembered how long ago it was. Apparently, she remembered who was standing in front of her now. Rocks began to fall from the sky. Dust swirled around. The storm was rising again. "Sir, I'm shocked. I can't understand what happened to her. What was this pressure and how did she make the storm rise?" We seem to have grown younger. Her long snow-white hair developed and turned into full tentacles of a monster. She asked if he was not glad to meet them because they had not seen each other for so long. He looked at her and thought that he could win, and he didn't even hope that she would wake up. His eyes were burning with fear. He was confused. Looking at her, standing in the epicenter of the storm, he understood that he was wrong, period. He could not even really stand in front of her. And how could he manage to defeat her? She kicked the ground. The earth, small stones and dust swirled under her feet from the impact. Every second the storm grew stronger. Under its force, huge rocks could rise up, creating a terrible funnel. As if struck by some meteorites, the earth began to crack. And under the next one, right under the gentleman's feet, he was thrown back by a strong energy wave. All this was accompanied by such loud sounds that the birds from all over the forest hurried to leave their homes. I wished to wait out the trouble. The gentleman who had fallen to the ground backed away but did not take his eyes off the woman. He was paralyzed by the fear and horror he was experiencing. The woman stood over him, glaring. She said she didn't want to kill him, but he'd spilled so much blood that even his soul stank of it. The storm did not subside. She raised only one hand and held it in front of her. Her face was hidden by her hair and clothes. The man was gripped by a piercing pain throughout his body. The wounds reminded him of themselves and started bleeding. Blood splashed in all directions. He screamed, unable to bear it any longer. The woman stood over him and watched him suffer. It seemed that he was being torn apart by her power and hatred. It turned out that she made no effort at all to destroy it. Having dealt with him, she came to her senses a little. She tried to understand where she was and why she was here. As if for the first time, she noticed the broken medallion that lay on the ground away from her. With her strength and thoughts, she pulled him towards her. He rose and seemed to fly straight into her arms. Noticing the sandal, she also pulled it towards her with the power of her mind. She held the locket and the sandal in her hands. She didn't understand why her heart ached so much. She had forgotten something very important, and these things calmed her down. She looked at the man's battered body. His clothes were completely torn. His sword lay to the side. The appearance of these bandits was proof that the blood demon that could not be killed 50 years ago had returned. She told herself that she had to go. If the blood demon had returned, even her eldest son wouldn't be able to deal with him, period. She had to stop him even at the cost of her life. But it seemed she couldn't move from the spot. Something wouldn't let her go and wouldn't let her leave. But she understood that it was something very valuable to her, which she was about to lose. But she restrained herself and decided that finding the bloody demon was a more urgent matter. She didn't let go, she walked away. She had a goal that she had to achieve. I had a strong enemy, she couldn't waste time. She began to disappear like fog at dawn, just evaporating into the air. And after a moment, nothing betrayed her recent presence here. Only the bodies of her fallen enemies remained lying around, showing that something had clearly happened here. So Young stood there looking at the scene before him. He didn't expect to see what he had to see. He looked at the corpses of people. The clearing was all covered in blood, period. But he had only one question. He was interested in where his granny was and what happened here. He began to call her loudly throughout the forest. He shouted as loudly as he could and hoped that she would respond. With his cry, he frightened the forest birds, whose flocks rose and flew away. The guy came here when he heard the sound of a gunshot, period. He did not expect that the situation would be so terrible and hoped that it had nothing to do with his grandmother. She looked at the fallen and thought about who they were, since she had to use so much power against them. His gaze fell on the fragments of the locket he had given her. He gasped. He walked over and picked it up. The realization began to dawn on him that his grandmother had been there after all, and had been involved in this. He came with the medallion tightly to his chest, very worried. He sat down on the ground and only mentally called her. He thought that she had been taken away, or even worse, that she had died. He called her with hatred to the sky again and again throughout the forest. He looked around the clearing and thought, period. There was nothing here. If something had happened to her, there would have been some traces left, but nothing except this medallion gave away what had happened. He begged the heavens that she would be okay, that she would be safe and sound. He noticed tracks that led deep into the forest. He cried out joyfully and ran up to them and began to examine them. A sword lay next to these tracks. He was very happy. Although the tracks were very weak, they definitely belonged to his grandmother. He was glad that she was alive, carefully studying the prints on the ground. He heard the crunch of branches under someone's feet. Someone was walking towards him. He froze and began to listen, looking around. It seemed to him that there were dozens of men. Were they with those guys? A man entered the clearing, looking at the aftermath of the massacre that had taken place. He chuckled and thought. So Young heard a cry begging to be left alone. He quickly turned around to look at who had come. In front of him stood two men, one of whom was holding a small child. The child was screaming and asking to let him go. He threatened them that they would kneel and ask him for forgiveness someday. The girl noticed her older brother and I called out to him. She didn't expect to see him here at all, but she was very happy about it. The girl asked what was wrong with So Young's expression and asked where their grandmother was. The man held the girl tightly in his arms. Behind them stood dozens of warriors awaiting their orders. The man looked at the young man, his gaze flying across the entire clearing, not ignoring what was happening. The gentleman stood, carefully studying the young man. He said that he could not do it. He said affirmatively that it was his grandmother and asked where she was. So Young said that she left. As if not expecting a negative answer, he asked if they could let his sister go. The gentleman asked the guy his name, to which So Young said that the gentleman did not answer his question. The gentleman asked with displeasure in his voice to share his name with him. Introducing himself as Kwak Seo Mun, He pointed out that the young men had no manners, since he spoke so rudely to the elder. So Young said with a rolling irritation that he would ask one last time for them to let his little sister go. He was unwavering, stood very confidently, and was assertive. The gentleman noted the young man's calmness, even after he heard his name, and claimed that he knew nothing about Kung Hao. So Young knew that the man standing before him was a master stronger than him, but he was not afraid of him, and knew that he could try to deal with him. He had no choice again. The gentleman hissed and repeated his question. He was interested in where the boy's grandmother was. Everyone stood their ground, and this was already a battle. The young man closed his eyes and concentrated, gathering all his energy and accumulating more. He gripped the sword in his right hand tighter. Opening his eyes, he said loudly and clearly that he would take his sister back. It sounded very confident, without a drop of doubt. The young man stood firm, and his eyes burned with bright lights of hatred. The master felt how strong the boy's aura was. Although he had not felt anything before, he, struck by this feeling, was riveted to him with his gaze. He thought that, at such an age, he would not be able to reach the level of refutation, but he had already completely mastered Qigong. So Young warned himself as he prepared for the fight. He had never fought so many people before. He should be more careful. But he pulled himself up for such thoughts. There was no time to think about it. He needed to save Yusong first. The gentleman told the man holding the girl that she should be left alive until he found out where Jin Mushinmo was. But if that was impossible, he should cut her throat. Something suddenly hit the man in the chest with great force and knocked him back. He forcibly released the girl from his hands. So Yang, who threw that stone, carefully watched the result and the further actions of these people. He did not take his eyes off his sister either. All of the Lord's men immediately rushed to attack the young man, thinking that it would be very easy to defeat him. He would not be able to cope with so many people. So Young, shouting to his sister to run away as fast and as far as possible, rushed towards the attackers, never doubting his actions. Yusong stood there, confused. She was scared and didn't know where to run, and she was also very afraid for her older brother So Young. Bouncing back from the blows, he shouted at her to run back. He had no chance to explain and show her, and he hoped that the girl would cope. Yusong ran as fast as she could to where her eyes were leading her, trying not to look back. The gentleman, seeing that she was about to run away, mockingly told her not to hurry so much, and suggested that they chat a little longer. He rushed after her. She had very little chance of breaking away from him. So Young screamed in denial as he saw the man running after his little sister. He wanted to rush to her aid, but many warriors were rushing at him, and he had to repel their attacks and defend himself. He was agile and quick. The training had hardened him well and given him a lot of experience and strength. He was able to bypass and slip through the master's men and rushed forward. The gentleman noticed how many tricks the boy knew. He raised his hand and sent several pebbles towards the boy. So Young reacted to his voice and turned around to see a rock flying straight at him. He didn't have a second to react. He saw the stone a centimeter away from him, and time seemed to slow down at that moment. It was very close and seemed huge to his eyes, but it exploded into hundreds of pieces as soon as it touched the boy's skin. With a crack, it crumbled almost into dust. The gentleman could not believe his eyes, and was surprised that the young man, at such an age, was already capable of such a thing. He saw the young man running towards him and did not believe that it was possible. He mentally called out to Jinmu Shinmo, asking what her secret was. What kind of talent did she have that she could raise such a child? He didn't understand, but there was no time to think. So Young was already next to him and he had to fight back. The young man fell from Kwakseol Munyon's counterattack. Lying on the ground, writhing in pain, he groaned, calling out his sister's name. Only strands of So Yang's hair were flying in the air. The gentleman was sure that he had hit him, but he was wrong. He was furious. How could the boy dodge this? He asked him about it, not expecting an answer. The young man hugged his sister, and she hugged him tightly in return, pressing herself tightly and hiding from everything in his arms, crying loudly. He calmed her down. He asked her not to cry and promised that everything would end soon. Having calmed down a bit and having pulled away from her brother, she shouted to those people that they were all dead now. She asked them if they knew how scary her older brother was when he was angry. The gentleman laughed, saying that children raised by a godmother are truly amazing. Even a little girl can threaten them. So Young said that now that he had his sister back, he wanted to ask for one thing. He looked at the gentleman without looking away. The gentleman, grinning, asked what the guy wanted to ask him for. So Young asked why they were all looking for his grandmother. This was the most important question to understand everything. He continued, noticing that the bodies lying here and the master's men were wearing the same clothes. He demanded to know why they had come to Wu Chang. The gentleman grimaced and said that now he would know that the godmother was not here, looking questioningly at the young man. So Yang did not take his eyes off him and stood firmly in front of his master. He remained silent, waiting for the answer he needed. The gentleman concluded out loud that the young man resembled the warrior Kang Ho, judging by his skills. But he knew nothing about them for sure, and he warned him that he should not open his mouth without knowing the whole situation. The guy stood there and thought that he had apparently made a mistake by attacking these people and demanding that they talk to him on equal terms. The master hissed that since Jinmu Shinmo was not here, there was no point in keeping hostages. He looked at the boy and thought that since he had reached such a level of skill at such an age, he should be killed before he became a real threat to the blood demon. There might not be another chance. The Lord gave orders to his men to start a bloody massacre and clean out everyone here, and then find the godmother. The men obeyed and prepared to attack. They began to advance on So Yang and his sister, who was standing behind him, without thinking at all that they were going to kill children. So Young told his sister that he needed her to get some sleep, which she was indignant at, since she couldn't sleep now without understanding the request. He lightly touched her face and she froze, looking at him questioningly. In a second, her body went limp, falling into sleep. He laid her down by the stones, saying that when she woke up, everything would be all right. Her carefree, innocent face no longer trembled with fear. It was completely peaceful. He looked at her and thought that the way she slept had not changed at all since the time when she was still a child. He stood up, gripping his sword tighter. He looked at the advancing men and tried to calm his anxiety. He had never fought with so many, but he knew that he would have to face many enemies alone, for the safety of his family, for the sake of his sleeping sister behind him. And the old man was much stronger than him, and it would be difficult to escape from him. So Yang spoke loudly to the warriors. He said that he was not at the level to immobilize them, but not to kill them. Therefore, they should all leave because he did not want to do this. The gentleman, grinning again, said that the young man's techniques were impressive, but apparently he took the nose. And does he seriously think that he can handle 10 hands with one? So Young repeated in an unwavering voice that he did not want to kill any of them and asked them to leave. The warriors had an order, even if they wanted to leave. They continued to advance towards the young man without blinking, their swords pointed forward. So Young turned around and looked at his younger sister after hearing sounds from the side. One of the old man's men was rushing straight towards her. A few more moments, and he would have achieved his cruel goal. So Yang darted, and using one of his moves, he decided to intercept the attacker in the middle of his path. He spun around in a multitude of somersaults, drilling the air. He managed to strike and intercepted the attack on his little sister, who couldn't even imagine what was happening now. He fell back from the blow. Blood sprayed from his wounds and he groaned. He fell to the ground. So Young screamed for them all to leave. His voice alone was ready to kill every living thing in this place. He was losing his temper. So Yang rushed at the man he was intercepting again, and with one swing of the blade, he cut off the hand holding the sword. The man howled in pain and surprise. The young man repeated again, shouting loudly that he did not want to kill any of them and that they should leave right now. But he knew that they would not leave. Another of the master's men rushed towards Yu Song, asking if the young man could survive in Murim with such a soft heart. The boy screamed when he saw the warrior who was about to kill the girl. He ordered him to stop, making attempt after attempt to stop the carnage. The warrior had already raised his weapon over the girl's body, and there was only a second left before it would take her life and plunge her into an eternal sleep. But he didn't have that second. So Young came out of nowhere and chopped his head off. He only had one try, and he didn't make a mistake and did everything right. He realized that he could no longer protect Yu Song without killing them. He couldn't stop them without taking every single life. The warriors jumped on him, wanting to cut him into pieces and doing the same to his sister. He fought back furiously and punished everyone who was near him. He was really strong. And he was able to learn many techniques that were now saving his sister's life. With just a movement of his hand and the power of his mind, he could throw a large man a good distance away, causing him injury. They flew away like chips from a fire. He couldn't do anything. So Young was scary in anger, just like his sister said, and he couldn't make a mistake. He pierced his enemies, showing no mercy at all. Blood flooded the ground beneath their feet, painting it the color of anger and hatred. The thought that if he wanted to survive, he would have to kill swirled around in his head, giving him more strength to hold on to victory. He moved masterfully. Every move was honed by hundreds of training sessions, years of study. He realized who Tae Heogong was. He understood what it was like when energy awakens on its own and spills out in full on the enemy. Now he himself attacked the master's men, and they stood, trying to defend themselves from the boy's fury. With each passing moment, So Yang understood more about the words he had heard earlier. Teheo was not Qigong. He was a deep form of Gong. He realized that when the heart becomes stronger, the energy also begins to change. Energy clung to him and he cut the warriors apart with one movement. He could not lose, and they could not win. The remaining warriors decided to attack first. Seeing what was happening to their comrades, fear began to take hold of them. One of them shouted to the others that even though they were the third position of the bloody blades, they couldn't handle this guy. And now it was clear why the elite lost their lives when they encountered the old woman. In response, it was said that despite this, the third generation of bloody blades will not lose to whoever this guy is the grandson of. They prepared their swords. The man rushed at the guy, shouting that he would kill him anyway, even if he had to lie down on his bones. So Young rushed to meet the next fight without wasting a second. Strengthening from the attacker's sword, he collided with him with their bodies. The handle of the young man's sword went somewhere deep into the man's clothes. With one sure move, So Young pierced him through, taking away his chance to live. Still conscious, the man picked something up, holding it in his hand. He smiled despite the death approaching him. Gathering all the strength that had not yet left him, he crushed something in his hands and some kind of dust fell and flew around. So Young realized that it was poison. He was completely surrounded by a cloud of poisonous dust. Landing on his feet, he tried to cough. His eyesight was poor and his lungs were reluctant to take in air. He was distracted. The man shouted to the others that this was their chance to kill the boy and ordered them not to hesitate. He was on his knees bleeding, but his eyes were shining with the luck he had received. So Young bowed down, but he wasn't going to give up. He tried to concentrate, but his energy was scattered. The master ordered to stop all this, coming closer and taking out his sword. So Young coughed and spat out blood, but still tried to get his strength back. The master told him that it was useless to resist any longer. His talent was more powerful than that of the shaman's apprentice, but advised him to settle down comfortably and die. So Young turned around and looked at the old man. He denied everything he had said and even what he felt with his body. He saw two men approaching his sister, indifferently stepping over the lying corpses of their people. So Young jumped up and yelled an order to stop. It was a roar that stirred the blood in the veins. He warned them, threatening to kill them all if they laid a finger on his younger sister, Yu Song. His grandmother's instructions echoed in his head, telling him to control his own destiny and not let it control him. He remembered that it was the next day after the battle with Mayu Pil, and he still asked why she did not allow him to kill him. She replied that she did not know if he had control over his destiny, but that if he did, he would become a demon. And she asked if he wanted to kill people with the art he had studied to protect. He stood opposite the gentleman who did not allow him to escape his field of vision. He closed his eyes, focusing on the words his grandmother had spoken, remembering every single word, letting the words flow through his body. And his strength began to return to him. His body began to fill with its former energy. The gentleman ran towards him, carrying a sword in front of him, shouting that he felt strength in the guy's slow breaths. And this drove him crazy. He jumped, wanting to wound the young man with the sword in front of him and finally force him to shut up and for the strength to leave his body. So Young dodged the sword blade and asked if he hadn't asked them to stop, throwing his sword like a spear. He struck down both men who approached his sister. Their heads flew off their shoulders. He made them cease to exist. They only managed to see, through the fog that quickly grabbed them in its embrace, the outline of Yang's face. The gentleman roared and called the young man a bastard, denying what had happened. He stood, trying to comprehend what was happening before his eyes. He didn't believe that the poison hadn't worked on the guy, and he, it seemed, was already able to kill two of his men with one foot in the next world. He rushed at the young man again, shouting that he would kill him now. He was furious with the anger that filled him. He struck blow after blow with his sword, but the young man deftly dodged each one. They said that nothing lasts forever between the earth and the sky. The world is constantly spinning in an endless cycle. But at times, it moves so slowly it's as if it stopped. So Young heard his grandmother's voice telling him that in order to achieve enlightenment, he must synchronize his breathing with the breathing of heaven and earth. Another blow from the gentleman hung over So Yang. Grandma's voice sounded in his ears. He pushed the man back again, forcing him to stop. The young man continued to move, not giving his opponent even a second to catch his breath and gain strength. The gentleman roared with anger. He saw how deep in thought the boy was, and this irritated him even more. The next blow was delivered again. This time So Young was the one who flew away. He made a mistake and was sent back, making it clear. Blood poured out from the wound he had received. He thought that it was all over, hitting the ground and losing only the strength he had gained. pain penetrated every cell of his body, forcing him to abandon his plan. The attacker, unable to take advantage of such a chance, tried to subjugate every moment and went on the attack against him. It seemed that in another second, he would pierce him with his sword and accomplish what he had wanted for so long with all his being. But he could not allow himself to be defeated. He gathered all his knowledge together, accumulating energy. He repeated all his skills, preparing his body for the upcoming and final fight. He managed to repel his master again. The clash of swords filled him with laughter. The man lost his balance and began to fall, desperately trying to grab hold of the air. He did not believe that the young man had used this skill, which he in turn had only managed to develop at the age of 40. He couldn't understand how a guy who was barely 20 years old could achieve this skill. The gentleman thought that the guy had been poisoned. Apparently, he had another source of energy that he didn't know about. And suddenly he realized that it was Mushin Mojin. After all, he could not find any other options. He scolded himself for not thinking about it earlier. After all, this guy was Mushin Mojin's grandson. He was afraid. He couldn't stay here any longer because he didn't know when she would be able to appear here again. He told the remaining men to retreat immediately, worrying that they might not make it in time. So Young gritted his teeth as he watched his enemies run for their lives, repeating to himself that he couldn't let them go like this. No one needed to be told again. Everyone rushed from their places and hurried away into the thicket of the forest. The boy began to cough again, causing his body to spasm and cough blood. The poison had apparently just begun to work, affecting the boy's lungs. He bent over the ground, trying to swallow at least a little more air. His chest was burning and he couldn't move. The coughing didn't let him come to his senses and didn't subside, only getting worse and making his chest melt. The sun was already setting. Clouds the color of the sunset were visible above the already darkened treetops, which simply seemed like black blots against the sky. So Yang was still lying on the ground. There was already blood under him. He was coughing and still didn't want to let go. He reassured himself that everything would be fine, but he didn't believe it. He imagined that this was the path to the great void, and that this was what was supposed to happen. His mind was foggy, as if he suddenly began to feel his grandmother's embrace. This feeling made him wake up and jump up. He remembered his sister, who was still lying unconscious on the subject of huge stones. He tried to get up and look at his sister again. He was worried that something had happened to her while he was struggling with the poison. But she was lying in the same place where he had left her, peacefully immersed in sleep. He breathed a sigh of relief, making sure that she was okay. He stood and looked at his sister, knowing that if there was even a chance that she was dead, he couldn't bear it. Grandma would be right. The anger would drive him crazy. Somewhere deep in the forest, voices parted. Someone spoke in their excitement and worries. Yonghua wondered why her older brother and younger sister hadn't returned yet. Her brothers were standing nearby. One of the brothers wondered if they should have gone to Mosan. Sengzhou said that if there was danger, shouldn't they hide near the house instead of going all the way back to Mosan? Yonghua replied with displeasure that she followed them because they wanted to hide, but they were pitiful to look at and did not understand the whole situation. Her brother answered that he still doesn't understand, period, but he knows for sure that there is a big fight going on there. Well, the ground under them is still shaking. But most of all, he is worried about her dream. The sister said that she could not wait any longer and would go there alone, and her brother begged her to wait a little longer. If they did not return, then she and her brother would go looking for them. She told them that they couldn't even scout out the situation, and besides, if there were enemies there, she was the only one who could fight. She said that she was ordered to protect them. The brothers agreed with part of what she said, but tried to object to everything else. She asked them to be silent, starting to listen to the sounds. The guys looked at her with displeasure. The girl ran forward, talking about her older brother. She did not hesitate and did not doubt her decisions at all. So Young could barely walk, but he had his younger sister on his back. He was very exhausted, but he forced himself to stay on his feet. Yonghua ran up to him, extending her arms. She was very happy to see him, so Young smiled when he saw his sister standing in front of him, safe and sound. She saw the wounds on his body, his exhausted and battered appearance, and asked what happened here. And here she noticed her little sister, who was being held by So Young behind his back. She thought that something had happened to her because she was completely unconscious. Her brother reassured her, telling her not to be surprised since the girl was just sleeping. Yonghua breathed a sigh of relief. The rest of the brothers ran up to them, turning to So Yang and making sure that everything was okay with him. He replied that he was glad that everyone was safe, although he was a little worried when he saw that the house was empty. The other brother replied that they had used art and hid. Concerned about the wounds on his brother's body, he offered to heal them. But his brother refused, saying that he could do it himself and that it was time for them to return home. It was already completely dark and there weren't even any stars in the sky. Only the dim light coming from the hut could slightly illuminate everything around. The older brother told me about people who were looking for their grandmother. I thought that judging by their uniforms, they must have a lot of military resources. They tried not to make noise because the younger sister was still asleep. Yonghua turned around in shock when she realized that these were the people who kidnapped Yu-sun. The younger brother felt irritated and hatred appeared in his eyes. He was worried about both his younger sister and his grandmother, who no one should hurt. Seng-jo said that he now understood what had happened. The older brother asked him again what he meant. The three of them sat in a triangle, figuring out what to do next. He replied that he was sure that the two of them did not understand anything, but he knew someone who freely came and went from Muchang. The sister, realizing the situation, said that the grandmother was apparently an unusual person. The brother said that he also knew that grandma was an unusual person, and he added that grandma was a much greater person than they thought, and no one could compare to her. The brother asked if this greatness was connected with Kang Ho's blessing, and the brother and sister looked at him questioningly. The bud revealed a serious secret. So Young said that those people called Grandma Shinmura, and it turned out that Grandma really participated in a serious battle. Because of some things they learned from her, their family is going to be killed. Yonghua sweat dropped and asked if that meant they would come back. Her brother told her he wasn't sure, but it was possible. She asked what they should do then. Her brother told her that if she imagined the worst-case scenario, they would be better off leaving. Seng-jo said that he also thinks so. It is better to find shelter and move to a safer place. So Young turned to his brother and asked if he could take care of his sisters. Seng-jo looked at his brother in confusion and asked why him and where So Young was going to go then. So Young replied that he was going to accompany their grandmother and help her if needed. The brothers and sisters looked at him in shock. They couldn't believe their ears and were definitely against it. Yonghua looked at her older brother with disapproval and asked how he was going to look for their grandmother with such wounds alone, especially since he didn't even know where she was. He smiled back at her and assured her that she shouldn't worry, and that he was more worried about them and their sisters and brothers. Yusong finally woke up. She very sleepily turned to So Yang. "Pay attention to yourself." Everyone turned their gaze to her. "You were very happy." Yonghua picked her up and hugged her tightly. She asked if the baby was okay, patting her back. Yusong smiled with joy at seeing her family and replied that everything was fine. She asked if her older brother was really going to find their grandmother, worried about him, so Young confirmed his words. The little girl hugged her sister tighter. It was obvious that she was very worried and did not want her brother to go anywhere, but she only asked how soon he would return. The young man tried to calm her down and convinced her that of course he would try to return as soon as possible. He did not want to frighten his sister even more, although he knew that his journey would be long. All the children were silent, trying to enjoy the last hours together. Everyone understood how dangerous it was, but they did not dare to contradict their older brother. They began packing that same evening. It was already very late, but loud voices could be heard from the hut, indicating a commotion and arguing with each other. So Young asked Tae-sung if he was going to take everything he had collected, and he answered that of course, because he had carefully sorted it all. The young man did not argue with him. So Young asked his little sister if she had taken everything she needed for this long journey. The little girl was holding a toy in her hands and was very scared of what was happening. She held the hand of one of the elders, clutching her toy even tighter. So Young noticed how awkward she was, but he understood that she was still at that age when she depended on adults. And he understood that they all still depended on Granny, no matter how grown up they seemed. They waited outside, so Young was indignant and asked why Yonghua hadn't come out yet. They were wasting time. He went inside the house, which had noticeably changed since Granny had arrived. His sister was sorting through the dishes and said that she needed to get something else. He looked at her and didn't know what to say. He asked her why she needed so many things because they don't go away forever. He was alarmed by her appearance. She continued to rummage through things, arguing that I just needed to take one more thing. He replied that this was enough in his opinion, and asked if she was going to take everything from this house. She screamed in frustration. She said she was going to take everything from this house to spite him. She was very angry and could not control her emotions. Seng-jo ran to the door to the screams. Everyone looked at her in confusion and did not know what to say or do to calm her down. She started crying. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she said that all these things contained memories of their grandmother. She looked at the pot and remembered how her grandmother had cooked tofu and porridge in it for them from the first day. She looked at the wooden spoon that her grandmother had taught her to cook with. She kindly asked the girl if she wanted to try stirring the food herself, and she happily agreed. She didn't want to forget a single thing that was connected with their friendly grandmother. Grandmother always praised her for cooking and claimed that her future husband would love her very much. The brothers looked at their sister in confusion and did not know how to approach her. She was very upset and worried. They also remembered moments connected with their grandmother. The eldest remembered how he came to the kitchen, and his grandmother asked if he was hungry since he went there, and how she invited him to come inside and she would make him something delicious. She smiled tenderly at him and always cared about his comfort. Echoes of the past reached him. Memories washed over him like waves. He did not resist them. He remembered how he and his brother argued about who was taller, shouting loudly at each other. They almost fought. His younger brother said that he would be much taller than him and was looking for a fight. Grandma yelled at them and tried to calm them down, called them scoundrels, but it wasn't offensive at all. She approached them and asked them to stand still and measured their heights in order to resolve the dispute and settle the conflict. She looked at the result and smiled, surprised at how big her grandchildren had become and when they managed to grow so big. The dispute was settled and forgotten, and they continued to play happily and amicably. She could settle any of their disputes and reconcile them, making them forget all the grievances. She always greeted them with a warm dinner, which she and her sister had prepared together. She was always kind and caring about them. For them, Grandma was the person who showed them what a home is, showed them what care and support are and how bright and cozy their home can be. This person showed them parental love. She looked after them, made their beds, and cooked their meals, period. She cared about them being healthy and happy. So Young couldn't help but cry himself. He really hoped that they would never be able to come back here again, and everything would be like before. He stood there with tears rolling down his cheeks. He reassured himself that they would definitely return home when it was all over. They will definitely come back here with their grandmother and will continue to take care of each other. Tears continued to flow from his eyes like rivers. The memories of those happy days did not leave him. He hoped that they would be able to return and live as before. Before his eyes was the image of his grandmother waving to him near their hut. She was very smiling and friendly and was so familiar. It was time to set out. All the children stood on the forest path and prepared for the upcoming journey and said goodbye to each other because they had to split up. So Young handed his sister something and told her to take it, and he trusted her to take care of the family as the eldest. The girl looked at what he handed her and looked at him with bewilderment. It was a bag of money. There were about 15 silver coins in it, and she asked him where he got so much from. He said that this was the money that he and his grandmother had saved for her wedding and for Taesung's education. They had another purpose, but it was better to use them for the need if necessary. She tried to return them back, saying that he would need them more. No one knows how long the journey will take or even where exactly he will have to go. He refused because he will take care of himself. The girl looked at her older brother. I was very sad and she was very worried about him, but she was very grateful for his care. So Young gave them instructions to avoid crowded roads until they got out of Muchang, and to be careful and to simply run away if there was danger. No, they didn't look at him silently. They understood everything, but they still didn't want to say goodbye to him. Yusong was about to cry. So Young said that he should go and look for his grandmother already because he had already lost too much time. One of the brothers asked him with tears in his eyes to bring Grandma back. He believed in him and knew that he would cope with this task. So Young didn't answer him and stood there for a moment just in silence, trying to remember what they looked like. The other children also looked at him silently, barely holding back their tears. He turned around and went first. The children also went their own way, trying not to lose much time. On the way, they walked in silence and remembered their grandmother, and they wished that time would pass unnoticed and they would not be able to return to each other. There was some kind of argument going on at the checkpoint in Muramang Chang'an, and indignant shouts could be heard from inside. Someone was against making a report and did not feel obligated to do so. At the table, there was a gathering of 12 people in cloaks. One man was sitting in the center. Apparently, he was the main one and listened to the rest of the people sitting in a circle at the table. They said they had too many casualties and they had to confirm if it was true. And how would they take responsibility if they made a false report about unrest among the soldiers? Another said that they would have to put up with unrest, period. Even if there was an uprising, they had to report it. The gentleman sitting in the center was wondering who benefited from this. Perhaps it was a trick and there could be a spy in this group. He asked his mother what he should do. Someone from the group shouted that he was also against such an untrue report. The rest confirmed their agreement with silence, looking sideways at their master. One of the elders suggested that this could be the work of Sergeant Tacho and waited for an answer. In response, he was told that there were a lot of things that they misunderstood and that it was impossible to make any conclusions or assumptions so quickly. The elder continued to say that at the moment, many clans were fighting for supremacy, but without a doubt, they would make a foolish attempt to attack this city and take all the glory for themselves. Correcting myself without explaining it would be easier for me to simply stop the chaos happening in the world if they don't do something urgently. The rest of the people in the circle began to look at each other and whisper, commenting on what this old man had said. The gentleman was asked what he thought, period. It is unlikely that he agrees with what his army says, but his opinion had to be heard. The gentleman sat and assumed that his dignity had fallen to the lowest level. Since his people could so easily put pressure on him, rest assured of impunity. The gentleman replied that the merchant Yong Ho was right and that there was no need to commit treasonous acts. He was brief in his statements and wanted to listen more to his people. The old man noted that this was very noble, smiling strangely. The gentleman stood up and said he wanted to change the subject. The people at the table fell silent, waiting for their master to speak, although they were not happy about it. He recalled that when Yuan left and was replaced by a new ruler, Murim descended into chaos. There were places where people supported victory, and there were places where people chose to fight for it. And when Ming was established, the court did not recognize Murim. However, Murimang was founded during the execution of the emperor's secret mission. The Lord decided to go from afar in his conversation. He repeated the history of their city that everyone already knew. He told about the Protestant Church of Ilvol, whose goal was to punish the cult of Magyo. At the same time as the city was founded, Magyo was removed from power and eventually disappeared from Qionghai completely. However, with the retreat of the Ilvol Church, a much worse disaster came. The Blood Horse, who was formerly the Sinval Zionist Oathbringer, vowed revenge, and this was what he lived for. He called himself the Blood Horse, saying that if the Murim Jan acknowledged him, he would become a true demon. He summoned people from the church and caused a bloody riot in the world. He was far stronger than the leader of this church. No one in Kang Murim dared to challenge him. The gentleman continued to walk around the table and said that they could not have defeated him without the help of heaven, and everyone knew about it too. Silence reigned in the hall. No one dared to utter a word, interrupting the gentleman or disputing his words. The gentleman was outraged by the silence of the people. He continued that when the emperor gave a secret order to the institution to suppress Magyo and the Blood Horse, and the rebellion came, nothing changed. The old man decided to speak. He said that he understood what his master was saying, but he saw no reason why Sergeant Tacho would commit such a crime. The gentleman asked again what they would do. Would they allow the one who is going the right way to achieve nothing, adding that Kunlun is not a passage, and if not, what is he trying to achieve? The old man did not answer him and lowered his gaze somewhere down, not daring to even raise his eyes to him. The gentleman said that he understands the feelings, but if they ever run into internecine conflict, the suffering of ordinary people will increase many times over, period, and therefore he would like to remain neutral. Everyone was outraged by what the gentleman said, and damn it, they don't agree with his position. The gentleman replied that they did not have enough evidence, so they should wait for the result of the investigation. However, he would prefer that it be conducted in secret so as not to bother anyone. Someone mentally praised himself and was pleased with what the gentleman said, and he could not deny what he heard. Mr. Sukor suggested that they end the meeting and not waste time by passing their decision on to the elder in Namyang. Some responded in agreement, but they did not raise their eyes. They had no choice but to obey the order. The gentleman chuckled contentedly and said that he would then leave everything to them. All the people in the assembly did not utter a single word, but bowed their heads in submission. The gentleman wished that these people were right. He blamed himself for his words, but he also had no choice. He knew that if this happened, he would resign and happily leave this city. Well, if not, then he will be able to raise his status to emperor, earning a lot of respect from the inhabitants of this place. He thought that he could become the first person under the heavens, just like the Blood Horse a long time ago. It had already blossomed, and a new day had dawned. The mountains held their positions with fortitude and did not succumb to the influence of time. So Young managed to visit many places, including the one where the massacre took place. He studied every trace, every little thing that could tell him where his grandmother was heading. But the search had not yielded any results yet. He had only found traces of hands and feet. The shark was worried and he doubted whether his grandmother was alive. But I immediately pulled myself up short of such thoughts and convinced myself that she remained alive and unharmed. I scold myself for such thoughts. He recalled the words of Wun Chang, who told about the famous bandit called Tai Hengmado, who lived near Samjin. She said that the bandit was a ruthless man and had made enemies everywhere, and many warriors were in Sajin with the goal of catching and killing him. He looked at the beginning of the dead soldiers and assumed that it could be this bandit. Or perhaps the soldiers could use him to cover up this incident. He needed at least some kind of a clue and decided to go straight to this bandit. Even if it doesn't help, he has to try. He hurried to search for Taming Mado, trying to cling to anything. The city was very lively. Many people with horses, traders, and gentlemen were going about their business. The young man walked between them, looking around in search of his target. He tried not to lose sight of any little thing that could help him. He wondered how many enemies this man had, looking at the men with guns in a completely calm environment. They were probably looking for him too. And if these people were looking for him, his job would be much easier if he followed them, period. That way he could find him faster. He followed the people into the tavern. He needed to get something to eat anyway. The tavern was full of people. Some were already having dinner and chatting with each other, while others were just making their orders. He sat down near the people he followed so he could eavesdrop on their conversation. One of them was talking about this man whose skills reached the sky, and about the young man who should not attack him. Another asked to leave the guy alone, and that judging by his appearance he came to earn money by finding the bandit's secret treasure. Period. After he was beaten well, he would go home. They easily understood who the young man was looking for. So Young did not understand how he was a treasure, they say, and was embarrassed that he was exposed so quickly. He approached one of the waiters and asked that he had heard that Tai Mado lived in this area and could he tell him anything. He replied that he lived in the north near Kwakjumado. The boy asked about the treasure he had heard about. The waiter replied that according to rumors, he stole Docheonzong Dachionhwa's secret treasure. The boy asked again if he had heard the name correctly. The waiter nodded in confirmation, saying that he had achieved enlightenment. In the past, Namyang was hiding somewhere, and as soon as the bandit heard that this man's friend had died, he stole his treasure. The young man thought about what he had heard, trying to find some benefit in it for himself and his purpose. The boy continued to sit enjoying his lunch and trying to hear some more useful information about this tavern, listening to the waiter. He spoke of the imminent arrival of the Murim Alliance because of the bloodshed, and this will be the last chance for ordinary people. Once the alliance starts to act, it will no longer exist. He expressed his assumptions that the young man was also a very ordinary guy. The young man did not answer him. The boy thought about the waiter's words. The secret book of the sword god was useless to him and he needed to find out the whereabouts of his grandmother. The waiter said that the customer had behaved decently and left a good impression, but he wanted to tell him to get cocky and go away. So Young turned to the waiter again, who waited for a question. The young man asked if he knew where the Tai Hang Blade demon was now. He was very persistent and wanted to get him out of there as quickly as possible. He looked at him in surprise and replied that everyone knew what was in the north, but they didn't let him finish and interrupted the person at the next table. They said that there was an unchem in the north, falling into silence. The waiter looked at the man who said this with fear, not daring to say anything in response. The young man stood up from the table, looking belligerently at the man at the table. He thanked the waiter for the information he had received from him about many things, period, and placed a coin on the table as payment for the dinner and the information. The waiter was happy, but said that it was too much. I don't even think about giving the coin back. So Young hurried out of the tavern. The men at the table were surprised that the young man left gold with the waiter. It was not much, but 3 times more than what he had to pay. The waiter looked at the boy with admiration as he left. The man at the table assumed that he had decided to be generous before his death. Another one pulled him up and said that he was in too much of a hurry, and it seemed that he had gone into battle fearlessly because he had not yet known the world. The waiter was surprised when he looked at the man at the table and asked why they didn't stop him, period, unless the location of the blade demon is only approximately unknown. The man replied that that was it, period. But he shouldn't tell the villagers that directly, since there were already plenty of people who came from different places all over the world. The waiter was upset and said that he was sorry that the young warrior also wanted to risk his life in vain. The young man did not waste time. He walked towards his goal, stopping at a high mountain covered with greenery. He looked at the very top. He did not hear what place the men told him exactly, but he heard only the first syllable. This place was similar to him, but he doubted whether he was going in the right direction. He tried to remember or at least understand the name he needed, period. And suddenly he remembered that this was it, and perhaps one of the brothers had already pronounced it. This was Mount Unhyung, the place he needed. It took him a long time to get to her. The sun was already setting and its sunset rays were coloring the wooded area around. It got dark as quickly as the whole day had passed. Everything was plunged into darkness, and only some moving lights from the forest attracted attention. Many men with torches were walking through the forest and searching for something. Perhaps it was a secret or they spent days searching for it. After all, it was already night. So Young sat high in a tree and watched the search party. He wondered what kind of place this was and what these people were looking for here. On the way, he saw 4 dead people, and they must have attacked the blade demon for the secret book and died. He could not understand whether it was worth risking his life for her. It was much more comfortable to fight against a man named Kwak Seo Mun, and now he is much more scared. He thought about how greedy people are. They always had a desire to climb higher. The boy was afraid of a world where such people exist. He sat almost motionless, not trying to make a sound to give himself away, and simply watched the people prowling in the darkness of the forest. He was waiting for the right moment. Having collected his thoughts, he jumped from the tree. He needed to find his grandmother as soon as possible. He thought that when he found his grandmother, he would never go out into the world again so as not to see such bad people. He stood in a half squat, closing his eyes and concentrating on his thoughts. He generated energy and accumulated his powers. I repeat, practice after practice. He said to himself that as he had originally planned, he would find himself an ordinary woman, marry her, and grow old with her. He would be able to live a normal life without greed. The young man listened to the conversations of people. 2 of them were talking about something. One asked to trust the other, but he did not finish, pointing at someone in the darkness. The boy understood that it was impossible to recognize a person by their voice, but he could determine the direction. The voice was heard from the south, and there were about 10 people. He listened to the conversation. They were afraid that someone might hear them, but they boasted that they were luckier than those who did not know the direction. So Young heard the direction they were going to go. He concluded that the demon was most likely clanking somewhere nearby. He tried to determine the direction of the world in which he should move, based on what he heard in the conversation between those 2. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a small child and paid attention to it, trying to understand where it came from. He begged not to kill and very pitifully apologized to someone. The young man tensed up and was ready to help. He ignored what he heard and tried to determine where he needed to go to help this child. He was a little unhappy that this was happening right now, when he had very little time. The young man pulled himself up and scolded himself for his thoughts, as if he had forgotten the reason why he studied martial arts. He thought about what he could finish immediately. If he went to the child very quickly, he would save him and be able to return in time. He used all his knowledge to reach the desired place as quickly as possible and began to seem to disappear into thin air. He felt everything in slow motion, but in reality it happened in seconds. His body seemed to start floating above the ground. He turned around in shock when he saw the picture that appeared before him. A man was lying on the ground, groaning and clearly injured. Behind him, the figure of another man was visible, hidden in the shadows. He came out into the light and you could see him. He was holding a small child by the hair. Then he was crying and screaming loudly. And in his other hand, he was holding a sword. A dot on his face was a crooked, mad smile. The young man ran up to the car lying on the ground and asked if everything was okay. He saw that he had a huge wound on his side. He had already lost a lot of blood. The boy gasped. First, it was necessary to stop the bleeding, and he began to examine the man and try to turn him onto the side that was most comfortable for him. A voice was heard behind him which indicated the boy's good hearing, and the boy had a very bad feeling. Without turning around, So Young asked the man behind him to introduce himself, bracing himself for a fight. The man roared that the child needed to be shut up. After all, he had a plan, and these guys ruined it. The young man jumped to another place, more advantageous for a possible upcoming attack. He repeated his question and asked the man to introduce himself once more. He stood there, baring his teeth in a crooked smile. He asked if the young man had come all this way just to ask his name. He was called Guakaju, the one who stole the book of the blade god. The boy asked again in complete surprise. The Taihang blade demon stood before him. They stood opposite each other, both not expecting this meeting, but they were ready for the fight. The young man thought that he had found this man faster than he had imagined. After all, he was his clue to finding his grandmother. The man asked if the young man was a follower of the founder's sect. After all, his eyes expressed interest when he learned about his identity. The young man replied that he was not interested in the secret book, but he wanted to ask something. He asked if he knew who the goddess was. The man laughed. You can't believe that the young man is not interested in the book, mocking him greatly. Having calmed down, He asked which goddess the young man was looking for, looking at him shrewdly. He said that Wushan has its own goddess and Tinsen has its own. So which goddess is the guy looking for? He started moving towards him. So Young shouted, ordering the blade demon to stop. And he threatened to attack him if he didn't stop, as if he believed what he said. The man laughed again. He reminded himself of his name again and said that he had been wandering freely around Gung-Ho for 20 years. He was about to crush a child thrown to the ground with his foot. He said that no one would have told him to stop without fear, but he didn't have time to finish what he had planned. The stone thrown by the guy flew right under his foot. Following his trajectory, he hit and got stuck in a tree. The blade demon was surprised that the guy had the finger-snapping technique. The young man stood and confidently ordered the demon at the blade to move away from the child. The man laughed, noting that the guy was not as simple as he seemed. The young man asked again if he knew who the goddess Dot was. I told him that he had one more question. Ask if he knew such a mark. The man, seeing the coat of arms, looked at the guy in shock. The young man found this symbol when he was examining the bodies at the battle site. This symbol must have flown off Kwak Seo Mun when he cut him. The blade demon looked at the coat of arms in confusion and did not understand how the young man could know about this sign. He thought that the boy could not be connected to the place where this mark was used, and he was just curious. The young man asked to study it more carefully and answer his question. The man laughed and said that the guy would shit himself when he found out what kind of place it was. The young man listened to every phrase. He did not yet understand what place the man was talking about. In general, I raised my sword and said that I was tired of chatter. He saw that the guy had skills and wanted to see what he could do against him, the demon of the blade. The child lying on the ground finally came to his senses and ran away. The man noticed this and, wanting to stop him, rushed after him. So Young threatened him and ordered him to stop immediately, rushing towards him. He shouted for him to let go of the child and get ready to attack. The blade demon ordered the young man to get out of the way, with a movement trying to throw the guy back and strike him with a sword. But So Young deftly dodged every blow from the demon. And the demon, well, for some reason, just dodged and did not respond at all. The blade demons confidently dealt blow after blow, praising themselves that none of the masters would be able to catch up with him in martial arts. The blade demon wanted to deal with the guy as quickly as possible, as if testing his skill, but the guy continued to easily dodge any blows inflicted. He noticed that the blade demon was in too much of a hurry, and that made him very vulnerable. The young man realized that this man definitely knew something about the mark, but he doubted that he was one of those people. The fight was on equal terms. No one could deal a damaging blow to the other. So Young still demanded to tell him everything about the place where this mark was used, insisting on his own. The blade demon told him to shut up, not wanting to answer his question. He just wanted to kill the guy and do it quickly. The earth lifted up the lot with cracks scattering everything around. One of the cracks went to the body of the wounded man. The young man quickly jumped up, trying to prevent this, and saved the man lying on the ground. The blade demon found this very funny. He called the young man a knight without stopping his blows in mockery. So Young was getting angry and demanding that it all stop. He fought very well for his age. The demon continued to laugh at the young man. He said that he was good at dodging, but still inexperienced, and he did not stop for a second. He looked at the guy and didn't understand how he could prioritize other people's lives over sacrificing his own. The young man had mastered the necessary techniques perfectly. His hands were spinning with a sword in his hand, and it was impossible to approach him. And finally, he went with the attack. Necho was vibrating with anticipation of meeting the blade demon. The boy's gaze exuded hatred and the intent to go to the end. The energy was spinning inside him, gaining momentum. The guy was overwhelmed with strength and thirst to deal with the demon and get what he wanted. The man continued to mock the boy. But don't forget to express your impressions that the guy is a very good swordsman. And he did not go into battle in silence. And this set the rhythm of the fight. The blade demon rushed towards the guy. So Young parried the blows with his sword, giving himself no room for error. He protected the wounded man and his escaped child. But the demon blade's power was noticeably superior to the young man's skills. In some situations, he had difficulty coping. The blade demon shouted to him that he must be able to take other people's lives to save his own point, and he must be ready to risk himself for the honor of not stopping and continuing to attack. And for advanced martial arts, he must be able to discard honor. He must learn from those who stand on his path to death. But the young man did not understand this and did not agree. They fought each other furiously, breaking the night silence of the forest. Each defended his own honor and pursued his own goals. The blade demon said that with the help of martial arts you can get everything you want. He said that you can kill anyone you don't like and take any woman on the street. With strength, everything is possible. He asked if the young men had a sister, coveting her honor. So Young felt more and more hatred towards his opponent and tried to get to him. The Blade Demon was glad that the boy was so easily provoked. This was the weak point of an inexperienced master. When the mind is disturbed, many mistakes can be made. So Yang flew towards the Blade Demon with a furious rage, striking again and again. But this was the mistake that the Blade Demon thought about. The young man managed to be hit with an attack and thrown back with a blow. So Young was flying, struck by his opponent's blow. Just one mistake could knock him down. He fell to the ground, slipped several meters, still not understanding what had happened. The Blade Demon raised his sword over the young man and said that he was quite talented, but he had chosen his opponent incorrectly, and advised him on the way to hell to try to remember that one should not interfere in other people's affairs. Voices were heard shouting that the Blade Demon must be surrounded. They heard a fight and immediately understood who would not participate. The Blade Demon roared in anger, not expecting such a situation at all. People were running towards this place, shouting and urging each other on. Lanterns became visible in the darkness. The Blade Demon thought that fighting the boy would take him too much time, period. He even dressed up as a monk for this, but it was a waste of time. But perhaps the disguise could work. There were too many people in Gangho who knew his face, but he had already saved his head and prepared a mask made to look like a human face. First, he needed to get out of this situation and find this little runaway brat. He looked at So Young, thinking about what to do next. So Young stood up, ready to continue again. He asked the Blade Demon how many lives he had taken for such bizarre arts. The Blade Demon stood there and felt a sense of foreboding from the boy's icy eyes, but he couldn't take his eyes off him. A gray-haired man jumped out of nowhere and rushed at the Blade Demon, calling him to death. Without the slightest effort, the demon threw the man away with almost a snap of his fingers like a crawling bug. So Young deftly caught the falling man, softening his fall and protecting him from possible injury. He placed it carefully on the ground, keeping his eyes on the demon blade. The Blade Demon noticed that something had changed, and he suggested out loud that the young man was not just a random child. For So Young, it didn't matter anymore because he didn't know anything about Shinmo. He had to find other places to understand the meaning of that mark. He stood up, approaching the demon blade, and said that he wanted to ask one last question, whether he regretted it. The Blade Demon went on the attack again, shouting death threats at the young man. The guy stood motionless, waiting for the man to approach and gathering his strength. The attacking blade of the sword slid through without touching So Yang, even though it was so thirsty for his blood and flesh. The boy intercepted the attack, grabbing Demon Blade's arm. It was the art of splitting souls, as the thief had quite rightly noted. They fought to the death, not giving in to each other and not allowing themselves to make mistakes or get distracted, masterfully mastering their art. So Yang was coping, but it was difficult for him to resist a warrior who was highly skilled in the martial arts. People continued to jump out of the forest, wanting to possess the blade of the secret book of God, or simply wanting the death of the Blade Demon. He, in turn, was hardly distracted by this, and easily moved away from their swords. With one hand, he could destroy his enemies without putting much effort into it. Heads cracked under his fingers, and screams accompanied the action musically. So Young tried to determine what he needed to do to defeat the Blade Demon or disappear from this place. But he couldn't afford to leave these people in danger. He fought to save each of them and demanded that they be released. With just one stone, he could interrupt the Demon Blade's murderous moves, freeing these people from his clutches. The young man jumped up to the demon, pushing away the man who rushed out of the forest and threw him away. Throwing it aside, he rushed further straight at the Blade Demon, who seemed to expect this from him. The man watched their battle as their swords flashed and they spun around in different fighting techniques, trying to defeat each other. The guy shouted at the demon to get away without slowing down the pace of the attack. People started jumping out of the forest one by one and rushing towards the Blade Demon. So Yang stopped and watched this. He stood watching what was happening and kept thinking about his enemy. He had to defeat him or get the information he needed. He had to find a way to win. He needed to follow the sound of heaven and earth. He breathed to stabilize his actions and his mind, to balance hardness and tenderness. But he doubted that it was about harmony in himself. Accumulating energy within himself, he prepared for the attack that would end this fight. The enemy's sword circled around him, trying to catch at least the edge, but he stood firm, ignoring the deadly blade. Meanwhile, people continued to try to attack the Blade Demon. So Yang saw that they could all die at once from his hand, which would not even tremble in taking their lives. The young man understood that he had to fight with his sword and not use only martial arts techniques. He rushed again at his enemy, assuring himself of a quick victory. The man shifted from foot to foot, thirsting for blood. He waited for each one in his hands and imagined how he would deal with them. The young man ran up and shouted to all the people to stay away from him. Period. Didn't they know that they were completely no match for him? People were indignant and shouted at him not to deceive them. They did not trust him in his words. I looked at him in surprise and didn't understand why he didn't think he wanted to deceive them. One of the people shouted at him that he was acting as if he was trying to save them, but in fact he was planning to take the blade of the secret book of God for himself. The young man asked them if their martial arts were more important than their lives. Well, the answer would be so clear. The point was that they were only interested in the sword. Their greed obscured their minds. He looked around, trying to figure out this situation. Seeing how people rushed at the blade demon again and again, I think they will be able to defeat him. He saw that their eyes were full of greed, and they were looking only for how to use the lives of others. Despite the fact that they tried to hide their fear, the young man clearly saw it, and he thought about what kind of place it could be. One after another, they did not fly away from the demon blade sword. So far, no one has managed to even scratch it. He roared and laughed at them. How could they claim to be a noble man? So Young tried to fight them, forcing them to retreat and abandon their plan. Someone hit him, blinding him. He fell to the ground, not a high sword from his hand, in a defensive position. The blade demon asked him how this could happen. Didn't he see the real world now, since he still tried to protect these people? An image of a woman popped into his head, asking him if he could see the real world. He froze for a second, trying to recover from the unnecessary memory that had surfaced and returned to the fight. He swung and wounded the attacker So Yang from behind. His blood splashed from the wound to the side. So Yang howled, thrown back and wounded by his enemy, cursing this moment as he flew. The demon showed that he no longer doubted that he could kill them all. He threatened that he would kill everyone and get out of here alive and unharmed. People looked at him in horror, not understanding what to expect in the next second.